In the summer of 1980, a woman was shown a photograph of her granddaughter and a prince. She looked at it for a moment. She said nothing that suggested concern. She said nothing that suggested hesitation. She was Ruth, Lady Fermoy, lady-in-waiting to the Queen Mother, one of the most trusted women in the royal household. Someone who had been at the center of palace life for 30 years and who understood, with a precision that very few people possessed, what the institution required from the women who entered it. She understood it because she had given her own life to it. She also understood, with the same precision, that her 19-year-old granddaughter, the girl she had watched grow up, the daughter of her daughter, the child she had known since birth, was not suited for what the institution would require of her. She understood this in the specific way of someone who has spent 3 decades inside the machine and who can see, from long experience, what the machine does to the people it processes. She said nothing. Not to the granddaughter, not to the prince, not to the officials who were arranging the match with the specific efficiency of people who had decided what they wanted and were organizing toward having it. She held her understanding in the interior, in the place where inconvenient knowledge goes when expressing it would cost you something you are not prepared to pay. What she was not prepared to pay was her position. Lady Ruth Fermoy had spent the better part of her adult life building a place at the center of the royal household. She had been a lady-in-waiting to the Queen Mother since 1960. She had cultivated the friendship between their families, the Fermoys and the Windsors, with the patience and the intelligence of someone who understood that such friendships were the most valuable thing a person of her specific ambition could possess in the world she had chosen to inhabit. The friendship was real. The ambition was also real. The two things coexisted in Ruth Fermoy, in the way that things coexist in people of genuine complexity, not as contradictions requiring resolution, but as simultaneous truths, each operating in its own register. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The granddaughter married the prince in July 1981. Hundreds of millions of people watched the wedding on television and found it beautiful. Ruth Fermoy was there, in the Abbey, in the position her decades of loyal service had earned her, watching the marriage she had not prevented, with the composure of someone who has made a choice and is living with it. The marriage lasted 11 years in the official sense, and considerably less in any honest sense. Diana would say, before she died, that Ruth had known, that she had understood what the match would do to the girl, and had stayed silent, because the palace mattered to her more than her granddaughter did. Ruth died in 1993, 4 years before Diana. She never publicly contradicted her granddaughter's account. This is the story of what Ruth Fermoy chose, and what the choosing cost the people around her, and what it reveals about the specific gravity that the royal household exerts on the people who give themselves to it completely. Ruth Sylvia Gill was born in 1908 in Aberdeenshire, on Scotland's northeast coast, the kind of landscape that produces in the people who grow up within it a relationship to endurance that is not romantic and not performed, but simply structural. The weather demands it, the terrain demands it, the specific quality of northeastern Scottish light in winter, which is the quality of light that has decided not to try very hard, demands it. Her father was William Smith Gill, a man of means rather than title, a distinction that mattered enormously in the early 20th century, in the specific social world that Ruth was born into, and that she would spend the rest of her life trying to transcend. Money without title was not nothing. It was also, in the calculus of the British class system, not quite the same thing as money with title, and the difference between the two was felt daily in the drawing rooms and the dinner tables and the specific social geography of a country whose arrangements still ran substantially on the old lines. Ruth understood this distinction from childhood. She was, by every account of people who knew her in her early years, unusually perceptive about the architecture of the world she had been born into, about who held what kind of position and why, about the specific mechanisms by which certain families occupied certain rooms and other families did not, about the distance between where she was and where she could get to if she applied what she had with sufficient intelligence. What she had was considerable. She was talented in the specific and serious way that distinguishes genuine musical ability from the performance of accomplishment that upper-class girls' educations of the period were designed to produce. She played the piano not as a social decoration, but as someone who had found in the instrument a form of engagement with the world that the social world alone could not provide. The talent was recognized early, developed seriously, and eventually took her to the Paris Conservatoire, one of the premier conservatories in Europe, not the kind of institution that accommodated dilettantes. She studied there in the late 1920s, in Paris between the wars, in the specific golden feverish atmosphere of a city that was simultaneously the cultural capital of the world and something that existed in a borrowed time it didn't yet know was borrowed. She absorbed what Paris offered, not only the musical training, which was rigorous and which she took with the discipline her talent deserved, but the broader education of someone encountering a version of life considerably larger than Aberdeenshire had contained. She returned to Britain with the conservatoire training and the specific quality that serious musical education sometimes produces, a way of paying attention that has been sharpened by years of close work on something that requires complete precision, that transfers from the keyboard to the observation of people and situations with the same accuracy it brings to the reading of a score. She was observant. She had always been observant. Paris had made the observation more precise. In 1931, she married Maurice Roche, the fourth Baron Fermoy. The marriage was, in the social arithmetic of the time, a significant step upward from the position she had been born into. Maurice Fermoy was American-born. His family had made their fortune in the United States before his father acquired the Irish barony that gave the title its specific flavor, and he was therefore an aristocrat of a somewhat different character from the purely English kind. The title real, the American pragmatism underneath it also real, the combination producing a man who moved through the British establishment with the ease of someone who belonged to it and the slight distance of someone who had not always been inside it. He was also a friend of the Duke and Duchess of York. This is the fact that the subsequent decades of Ruth Fermoy's life organized themselves around, and it is worth stating in its proper weight. Not an acquaintance. A genuine friend, the specific friendship of two families whose circumstances placed them in proximity, and whose proximity produced the warmth that proximity sometimes produces when the people involved are genuinely compatible. The Fermoys had Park House on the Sandringham estate, rented from the Crown. The Yorks were at Sandringham. The families shared the landscape and the specific country life of people who go shooting together and visit for weekends, and whose children grow up in each other's orbit. The Duke of York became George VI in 1936. His wife became Queen. Their friendship with the Fermoys continued. The friendship acquired, in the new context of the kingship, a different weight. The Fermoys were now the friends of the King and Queen of England, which was a form of proximity that the British social world organized itself around in ways that everyone within it understood, and that Ruth Fermoy, who understood the architecture of the social world with the precision of a person who had been studying it since childhood, understood completely. She was living on the Sandringham estate. She was the friend of the Queen. She was a woman of genuine talent and intelligence, occupying a position that was, by 1937, by 1938, by the war years that followed, exactly the position she had been working toward since she was old enough to understand that positions could be worked toward. 3 children arrived: Edmund, the eldest, who would inherit the barony; Mary; and Frances, born in 1936, the child who would grow up to be the mother of Diana, Princess of Wales, though in 1936 this was an event so far in the future as to be not merely unforeseen but inconceivable. Ruth managed the household at Park House, raised her children in the specific combination of country life and social aspiration that the setting provided, continued her musical work. She was not a woman who let the talent atrophy because the marriage had provided alternative sources of identity, and she eventually became the founding force behind the King's Lynn Festival, an annual arts festival in Norfolk that she organized and sustained with the same disciplined intelligence she brought to everything she organized. The King's Lynn Festival was, alongside her later position at the palace, the clearest external evidence of who Ruth Fermoy actually was. Someone who could conceive of a substantial project and execute it, who could navigate the politics of cultural institutions and local government and arts funding, who could bring people together around a shared purpose, and keep them together long enough for the purpose to produce something real. The festival produced something real. It ran for decades. Musicians of international reputation performed at it. It remains, in the cultural life of Norfolk, a living institution. This is worth noting because the portrait that Diana's later account of Ruth would produce, the portrait of a woman who prioritized position over people, who chose the palace over her own family, can obscure the extent to which Ruth Fermoy was also, independently of her royal connections, a person of substance. The connection to the palace was real, and was central to her adult life. It was not the whole of what she was. Maurice Fermoy died in 1955. He died at Sandringham, in the house on the estate where the family had lived since 1931. He was 56 years old. The death left Ruth a widow at 47, with the barony passing to Edmund, and the specific recalibration of position that widowhood in her world required. She was now Lady Fermoy, rather than Baroness, the title hers by marriage, but no longer the title of the current holder of the barony. She was also, at 47, in the specific territory of someone whose identity had been constructed in significant part around the partnership of the marriage, and who needed, with the marriage ended by death rather than by choice, to construct something else. She constructed something else. What she constructed was a position of increasing centrality within the royal household, a position that would define the remaining decades of her life more completely than anything else available to her, and that would give her access, at the center of the world she had been working toward since her childhood in Aberdeenshire, to the kind of significance that her talent and her intelligence and her ambition had always been oriented toward. She became a lady-in-waiting to the Queen Mother. The appointment, which came in 1956, a year after Maurice's death, was not accidental, and was not simply the palace's gesture of kindness toward a friend who had recently been widowed. It was the formalization of a connection that had been developing since the 1930s, the translation of a personal friendship into an official institutional relationship that gave the friendship a form that could survive beyond its original social context. The friendship had been real. The appointment made it permanent. As a lady-in-waiting, Ruth was now inside the royal household in the formal sense, attending the Queen Mother at official occasions, traveling with her, managing the specific social logistics of a senior royal's public life, being present at the occasions and the moments and the daily texture of a world that she had been orbiting since Park House and that she now occupied from the inside. She was exceptionally good at it. The qualities that had made her a successful organizer of the King's Lynn Festival, the intelligence, the social precision, the ability to read what situations required, and to produce it without the producing being visible, were exactly the qualities that the role of lady-in-waiting required. You were not there to be seen. You were there to make the person beside you visible in the way the occasion required, to manage whatever needed managing without the managing being apparent, to understand what was needed before it was asked for. Ruth understood what was needed before it was asked for. She was, in the accounts of the people who knew her in those years, extraordinarily skilled at this, at occupying the space between the visible and the invisible that the role required, at being present without being prominent, at serving without appearing to serve. She had spent her whole life practicing this, observing the architecture of rooms and understanding who held what position and how it was held and what was required for the holding. Now she was inside the most significant room available to her, and the practice had produced its reward, and the reward was real and meaningful to her, in a way that the people who would later question her choices did not always account for. This was not simply careerism. Ruth Fermoy was not a woman of simple careerism. She was a woman for whom the proximity to the institution and the institutional life that the proximity provided was a genuine form of meaning, the framework within which she understood who she was and what her life was for. The Queen Mother was, in this framework, the central relationship. Not the only relationship. Ruth had children, she had friendships, she had the musical life that continued alongside the palace life, but the central one, the relationship that organized the others around itself, that gave the framework its shape. The Queen Mother was also, for her part, genuinely fond of Ruth. The fondness was real and lasted decades. The Queen Mother was a woman who valued loyalty above most things, and who found in Ruth Fermoy a loyalty that was total and sustained, and given with the specific quality of someone who understood that loyalty was not merely the absence of betrayal, but the active presence of support, of attentiveness, of the willingness to be there in every form that being there required. Ruth was there in every form that being there required. The decades of being there, the 1950s and the 1960s and the 1970s, produced in Ruth Fermoy a specific kind of formation. Not the formation of her Aberdeenshire childhood, not the formation of Paris or the Conservatoire or the marriage to Maurice. The formation of someone who has given the primary years of their adult life to a single institution and a single relationship within that institution, and for whom the institution has become the organizing principle of the self. She was, by the late 1970s, someone whose identity was inseparable from her position. The position had not merely given her something, it had become something she was. The lady-in-waiting was not a role Ruth Fermoy played. It was, by this point, a significant portion of what Ruth Fermoy was. This is the essential fact about Ruth Fermoy that everything subsequent depends on. Not the talent, though the talent was real. Not the intelligence, though the intelligence was also real. The fact that the institution had become the organizing principle of the self, that the position inside the royal household was not something she had, like a job or a title, but something she was, woven into the fabric of her identity, so completely that the threat to it was indistinguishable from the threat to herself. In the summer of 1980, that threat arrived in the form of a question. The question was whether to speak. She did not speak. What the silence cost the people around her, her daughter, her granddaughter, the 19-year-old girl who was about to walk into a world that Ruth understood and that she had decided not to warn the girl about, is the subject that the following parts of this account are organized around. The silence began here, in the late 1970s and the early 1980s, in the specific condition of a woman for whom the institution had become the self, and for whom the self-preservation and the institutional protection were therefore the same impulse, operating from the same interior place, producing the same result, the silence. Frances Roche was the youngest of Ruth and Maurice's 3 children, born in 1936, and she grew up at Park House on the Sandringham estate, in the specific world that Park House contained, the country life, the royal proximity, the combination of genuine warmth and careful social management that Ruth had built into the fabric of the household. She was not Ruth. This sounds obvious, and is not. Children are not their parents, and children who are not their parents are frequently not their parents in ways that the parent finds difficult to accommodate. Frances was warmer than Ruth, more directly emotional, less organized around the management of what the emotion produced, more willing to let the feeling be visible, in the way that people for whom visibility feels natural let things be visible. She was also, from relatively early, someone whose sense of what her life should contain was not entirely determined by the framework her mother had built. Ruth had built a framework organized around position and proximity and the institutional world of the royal household. Frances was not indifferent to this framework. She had grown up inside it and understood its value in the way of someone who has never known the alternative. But she was not, in the essential sense, formed by it the way Ruth was formed by it. She wanted something more personal than position. In 1954, Frances married Edward John Spencer, Viscount Althorp, who would eventually become the 8th Earl Spencer, and whose family's connection to the Windsors was one of the longest and most deeply embedded of any non-royal family in England. The Spencers had been associated with the royal family for generations, as courtiers, as friends, as the specific kind of family whose presence in the orbit of the crown was so established that it had long since ceased to feel like proximity and had become simply the condition of being a Spencer. Johnny Spencer was not a complicated man. He was a conventional man of his class and time, generous in the ways that conventional men of his class and time were generous, limited in the ways they were limited, organized around the expectations of his world without particular interest in examining whether the expectations were the right ones. He was not cruel. He was not cold. He was simply a man whose interior landscape was not very large and who had married a woman whose interior landscape was considerably larger than the marriage would be able to contain. The marriage produced children: Sarah, born in 1955, Jane, born in 1957, then a son, John, born in 1960, who lived for only 10 hours, a death that landed on both Francis and Johnny with the specific weight of the death of a longed-for heir, which in the world the Spencers occupied carried implications beyond the personal grief and into the practical territory of succession and expectation. Then Charles, born in 1964, who survived and who became the heir. Then Diana, born in 1961, between the dead son and the living one, the third daughter in a family whose emotional atmosphere after 1960 was shaped substantially by the loss of the baby and the pressure around the production of the heir. Diana grew up inside this atmosphere. She was, by the accounts of the people who knew her in childhood, a perceptive child in the specific way of children who have been formed in households where emotional atmospheres are present, but not directly discussed, who learn to read the room before they can articulate what they are reading, who develop, in the gap between what is present and what is named, the specific sensitivity that comes from years of translating the unspoken. The unspoken in the Spencer household became, by the mid-1960s, increasingly difficult to keep unspoken. Francis was unhappy. The unhappiness was not the product of a single cause and is not accurately described as simply the result of a bad marriage. The marriage had produced years and children and the specific accumulated texture of a shared life that is not nothing. The unhappiness was the product of the specific mismatch between what Francis was and what the marriage was, between a woman of genuine emotional depth and vivid personal presence, and a man whose world did not have adequate room for either the depth or the presence. She had, by the mid-1960s, met someone else. Peter Shand Kidd was a wallpaper heir, the specific kind of English wealthy man whose money comes from an unglamorous source and who has organized his life around the kind of activities that money allows rather than the money itself. He was different from Johnny Spencer in the specific ways that the person who disrupts a marriage is frequently different from the person the marriage is with, more engaging, more immediately present, more apparently interested in the specific person Francis was, rather than the role she occupied in his life. She left Johnny Spencer in 1967. The leaving was the act that organized everything that followed in Ruth Fermoy's relationship to her daughter and granddaughter, the act that revealed what the institutional formation had done to Ruth's capacity to be a mother and a grandmother when the mothering and the grandmothering required something that the institutional formation did not produce. What the institutional formation did not produce was the willingness to prioritize the personal over the positional. Ruth's response to Francis's departure from the marriage was not the response of a mother who understood that marriages fail and that the failure is painful and that the person who has failed deserves support rather than judgment. It was the response of a woman for whom the social architecture of the world she occupied was more important than the emotional reality of her daughter's situation, who looked at what Francis had done and saw not a woman in an unhappy marriage making a difficult choice, but a woman who had violated the specific code of the world they both moved in. She sided with Johnny. Not privately, not in the quiet way of someone who has opinions about a family situation and keeps them in the family. Publicly, in the specific way that siding with someone in a custody dispute is public, through the testimony she gave in the subsequent legal proceedings, through the position she took in the acrimonious and prolonged dispute over the children that followed the separation. The dispute was genuinely acrimonious. The Spencers had resources and connections, and the specific advantage of a man in 1967 whose social position made his claim to custody of his children the default presumption of the legal system he was operating within. Francis had the moral claim of a mother who had been the primary parent. She did not have the legal advantage. Ruth's testimony tilted the scales. What she said, specifically, has not been made public in full. What has been made public, in the biographical accounts, in Diana's own later statements, in the records available from the period, is that Ruth's position in the custody dispute was not neutral and was not silent. She gave evidence that supported Johnny's case. She provided the specific kind of testimony that the social world she moved in would have found appropriate, which was the testimony of a woman who believed that Frances had done something wrong, and that the children should remain with the parent who had not done it. The children remained with Johnny. Frances went to Peter Shand Kidd. She would marry him eventually, after the divorce from Johnny was finalized. She would spend years in Scotland, in a life that was geographically and socially removed from the world she had been born into. She would try, across the years of the children's childhood, to maintain the relationship with her daughters, the access arrangements, the holidays, the phone calls, the sustained effort of a mother who is not the primary parent and who knows that the not being primary parent is a status she did not choose and cannot fully close the gap created by. Diana, who was 6 years old when the separation happened, and who processed it in the way that 6-year-olds process the departure of a parent, not through analysis, but through the body, through the specific quality of waking up in a house that is missing the person who was always there, and finding that the missing is not an event, but a condition, carried the weight of it for the rest of her life. She also, and this is the part that the subsequent story of Ruth Fermoy requires understanding, carried a specific confusion about her grandmother that would take decades to resolve into the clear-eyed assessment she eventually made. Ruth was present in Diana's childhood. She was not absent, not a remote figure, not someone who had removed herself from the grandchildren after the dispute. She was there, at Sandringham, in the world the children still moved through despite the changed domestic arrangements, at the occasions and the family gatherings that the social world of their class continued to produce, regardless of what had happened to the marriages within it. She was there as Lady Fermoy, as the grandmother, as the woman who played the piano beautifully and who knew the Queen Mother, and who occupied the specific position in the world that the children understood as significant without yet understanding fully why. Diana liked her. This is not complicated to understand, and it is worth stating directly, because the subsequent account of Ruth's failure toward Diana is not accurately described as a relationship that was always cold, or always distant, or always organized around the betrayal that Diana would eventually name. The relationship contained warmth. The warmth was genuine, in the way that warmth between grandparents and grandchildren is frequently genuine, uncomplicated by the adult tensions, operating in the simpler register of someone who finds a child interesting and a child who finds the adult's world interesting. Ruth found Diana interesting. Diana was, from childhood, an immediately engaging person. The emotional sensitivity and the social attentiveness that she had developed in the Spencer household expressed themselves in the quality of her attention to the people around her, in the specific gift of making people feel seen that she had from very early. She made Ruth feel seen. Ruth responded to this with the warmth available to her, which was the warmth of someone whose capacity for warmth was not extinguished by the institutional formation, but was organized around it in ways that made the warmth conditional on a degree that the person receiving it did not always recognize as conditional. The condition was the position. As long as the relationship with Diana did not threaten Ruth's position, as long as the grandmother-granddaughter warmth existed in the space between the family life and the institutional life without the two coming into conflict, the warmth was available. The conflict arrived in the summer of 1980. What happened in the summer of 1980 was not a single event but a development, the specific development of a relationship between Diana Spencer, who was 19 years old and who had been noticed by the Prince of Wales at a succession of events, and who was being moved, with the specific institutional efficiency of people who have decided what they want, toward the position of potential princess. Ruth knew the development was happening. She was inside the world in which it was happening, inside the royal household, inside the Queen Mother's orbit, inside the specific web of connections and communications through which the palace managed these things. She knew in the specific way of someone who is told everything by the people who tell her things, which was everyone, because she was Lady Fermoy, and Lady Fermoy was trusted. She knew what the institution wanted. She also knew, with the same precision, what her granddaughter was. She had observed Diana closely enough and long enough to understand the specific qualities of the 19-year-old in front of her, the emotional sensitivity, the perceptiveness, the vulnerability that the childhood had produced and that had not been processed into strength, the specific character of someone who was not yet fully formed, and who was being directed towards something that would require a formation she did not have. She held both knowledges simultaneously, the institutional knowledge and the personal knowledge. The institutional knowledge said, "This is what the palace wants," and the palace's wanting of things produces outcomes, and being on the side of what the palace wants has specific rewards. The personal knowledge said, "This child is not ready for what the palace is going to do to her." The two knowledges were in conflict. Ruth resolved the conflict in the way that a lifetime of institutional formation had prepared her to resolve conflicts between the personal and the institutional. She stayed silent. She did not warn Diana. She did not go to the relevant people and say what she knew. She did not do what a grandmother who understood what was coming might have been expected to do, which was to act as the advocate for the person she loved in the negotiation with the institution she served. She served the institution. The institution got what it wanted. Diana went forward into the thing she was not ready for. Ruth watched her go. The courtship, such as it was, lasted approximately 6 months. This is not a long time. It is, in the ordinary accounting of how people come to know each other well enough to build a life together, insufficient time, the duration of a season, shorter than most people take to decide whether to change jobs or move apartments, or commit to anything that will reorganize the fundamental structure of their daily existence. For Diana Spencer in 1980 and 1981, it was the duration between being noticed by the Prince of Wales and standing in St. Paul's Cathedral in a dress with a 25-foot train, saying words that would bind her, constitutionally and personally and symbolically, to a man she did not fully know. The people inside the institution who were watching this happen knew it was insufficient. Ruth was one of them. She was not the only one. The specific world of the royal household in 1980 contained people who observed the development of the Charles and Diana arrangement with varying degrees of private concern and uniform public silence. The culture of that world did not produce people who raised concerns through direct communication. It produced people who communicated through implication and indirection, and the specific management of what was said and what was withheld. And the management of the Charles and Diana situation was the management of people who had decided what they wanted and who were not organized around hearing reasons it might not be what they should want. What they wanted was a bride for the Prince of Wales. Charles was 32 in 1980. The public conversation about when he would marry had been running for a decade, with the specific quality of a conversation that the participants, the press, the public, the palace, understand is important without any of them being able to do anything directly to produce the answer. The palace had been looking. The looking had produced a series of women who were considered and found wanting, for reasons that the palace's specific requirements for a princess made finding wanting relatively easy. The woman needed to be young enough to be presumed virginal in the way the institution required, aristocratic enough to fit the social register the position demanded, English enough to satisfy the constitutional preference, and sufficiently uncomplicated in her previous life to survive the specific scrutiny that the position would impose. Diana Spencer was 19. She was aristocratic, more deeply connected to the royal world than many people understood, the Spencers having been embedded in the orbit of the crown for generations. She was English. She had no previous relationships of the kind that the scrutiny would find problematic. She was, by the institutional accounting, exactly what the requirements specified. She was also, and Ruth knew this, a 19-year-old who had grown up in a household fractured by her parents' separation, who had not gone to university, who had not built an independent professional life, or developed the kind of identity that comes from sustained engagement with the world outside the specific narrow territory of the upper-class English country life she had been formed in, and who was being directed toward a position that would require her to stand in front of hundreds of millions of people and perform the role of Princess of Wales with the composure and the institutional fluency of someone who had spent decades developing both. She had not spent decades developing either. She had spent 19 years growing up. The people who were managing the arrangement knew this, in the way that people who are organized around achieving an outcome know the complications of the outcome without being organized around the complications. They knew Diana was young. They knew the courtship was brief. They knew the position was demanding in ways that youth and brevity of courtship made more, rather than less difficult. They managed the knowledge by placing it in the register of things that would work out, that had always worked out, in the institutional history of royal marriages, with sufficient frequency that the exceptions could be treated as exceptions rather than as evidence of a pattern. The exceptions had names. The exceptions included some of the most thoroughly documented marital failures in the history of any institution on earth. The pattern was visible to anyone who looked at it with the honest attention it deserved. The institutional culture did not produce honest attention to patterns that complicated what the institution wanted. Ruth was of the institutional culture. She was also, and this is the specific tension that makes her story more than a simple account of a woman who chose position over family, someone who had personal knowledge of what the institution did to women who were not formed for it. She had watched Frances, her own daughter, move through the world of the upper-class English country life and find it insufficient, leave it for something more personal, and pay the cost of the leaving in the specific currency that leaving cost in 1967. She had not responded to Frances's insufficiency with compassion. She had responded with the institutional judgment, the judgment that Frances had violated the code and should bear the consequences. The judgment had been wrong in the specific way that judgments organized around position rather than around the actual human situation are wrong. Not false in their assessment of what the code required, but false in their assessment of what mattered more than the code. What mattered more than the code was Frances. Ruth had chosen the code. In 1980, standing at the edge of the same choice with her granddaughter instead of her daughter, she made the same judgment. She told people Diana would be suitable. This is the specific form her complicity took, not the dramatic form of someone who actively encouraged the match against their better judgment, not the simple form of someone who said nothing and let events proceed, the active form. Ruth Fermoy, in 1980, told the relevant people that Diana was a good choice. She was one of the people whose opinion the institution sought and waited, because she was Lady Fermoy, trusted, inside, known to understand both the institution and the family. She gave the institution what it was looking for. She gave it her endorsement. The endorsement mattered not because it was decisive. The institution had already decided, and the institution's decisions were not dependent on any single voice, but because it was the voice most positioned to complicate the decision. Ruth was the person who knew Diana most intimately among the people the palace was consulting. She was the grandmother, the family connection, the person who had watched this child across 19 years, and who had the most specific and personal knowledge of who Diana actually was. Her endorsement was therefore the most significant potential obstacle to the arrangement becoming the arrangement. She removed the obstacle. The specific conversations in which she did this are not fully in the public record. What is in the record is the outcome, that Ruth Fermoy's position regarding Diana's suitability for the role was supportive, that this support was communicated through the channels through which such things were communicated, and that it contributed to the institutional confidence that the arrangement was the right arrangement. Diana was not consulted in any meaningful sense. This is not literally true. She was asked whether she wanted to marry Charles, and she said yes. But the asking happened within a context that had been managing her toward the yes for months, in which the expectation of yes had been communicated through every aspect of the situation, in which being at Balmoral and being invited back and being photographed and being discussed in the newspapers was itself a form of management that made the no available in theory and unavailable in practice to a 19-year-old who was not equipped to identify the management as management. She identified it as romance. She was in love with the idea of Charles, which is not the same as being in love with Charles. She would say this herself, later, with the specific clarity of someone who has had years to distinguish between what she experienced at 19 and what that experience actually was. She was in love with the idea of him, with the idea of the role, with the idea of being the person the fairy tale required at the moment the fairy tale required her. She was 19 years old. The engagement was announced on the 24th of February, 1981. Ruth was one of the first people told. The telling was not an accident. She was told because she was Lady Fermoy, because she was inside the household, because she was the family connection that the institution maintained and that needed to be managed through the communication of significant institutional events. She received the information, and she processed it, and she did what the institutional culture required of someone who receives significant institutional information. She managed it appropriately. She did not call Francis. Francis learned about the engagement from the public announcement. Her daughter's engagement to the Prince of Wales, the engagement that would make Diana the most watched woman in the world within hours of its announcement, that would reorganize the entire public understanding of who Diana Spencer was and what her life would contain, was not something Francis was told in advance by her mother, who knew in advance. Ruth knew. She did not tell Francis. The not telling was not an oversight. Ruth was a precise woman. She did not overlook things. The not telling was a choice that reflected the same fundamental priority that had governed her choices since 1967, since before 1967, since the years when the institutional formation had become so complete that the institutional priority and the self-priority were indistinguishable. The institution did not require her to tell Francis. The institution required the management of the engagement through its own channels, in its own timing. Ruth managed it through the institution's channels, and in the institution's timing. Francis was not the institution's channel. Diana, in these months, was in the specific suspended condition of someone who has been told what is happening to them, but who does not yet fully understand what the thing that is happening to them is. She was engaged to Charles. She was moving through the preparation for the wedding, the dress fittings, the public appearances, the specific choreography of the months between the announcement and the ceremony. She was being formed, in real time, into the public version of the person the role required. The forming was not gentle. She was removed from her flat in Coleherne Court, the flat she shared with friends, the first independent life she had managed to build, the specific version of herself that the years before the engagement had produced. She moved into Buckingham Palace. She was placed under the management of the palace's household staff and the palace's communication apparatus, and the palace's expectations about how she should present herself, and what she should say, and how she should manage the press that followed her everywhere. She was 19 years old, and she was alone in Buckingham Palace, in a way that the externally observed version of being alone in Buckingham Palace does not quite capture. She was surrounded by people. She was not surrounded by the people who knew her, not her mother, who was in Scotland, not her friends from the flat, who had been left behind with the flat, not anyone who could receive the specific confusion and fear of what she was experiencing and reflect it back to her with the honest acknowledgement that confusion and fear were reasonable responses to this situation. She could have had Ruth. Ruth was there. Ruth was in the institution. Ruth was one of the people with access to the palace world that Diana was now inside. Ruth had known Diana for 19 years. Ruth had the specific knowledge of her granddaughter that the people surrounding Diana in Buckingham Palace did not have. The knowledge of who she was before the engagement had made her a public figure, the knowledge of what the childhood had cost, and what the character underneath the composure was actually made of. She did not offer herself as the person Diana could go to. Whether Diana would have gone to her, if she had, whether the relationship between them was sufficiently open for Diana to have expressed to Ruth what she was experiencing, is a question the historical record cannot answer with confidence. What the record shows is that Ruth did not make the offer, and that the absence of the offer was consistent with the broader pattern of her choices, which was the pattern of a woman who managed proximity to the institution with the priority of the institution at its center. The wedding was the 29th of July, 1981. 750 million people watched it on television. The streets of London were lined with crowds that had been gathering since the previous evening. The dress, when Diana stepped out of the glass coach at St. Paul's Cathedral, was revealed to be ivory and silk and embroidered with 10,000 mother-of-pearl sequins and 42 yards of fabric, and it was immediately and universally described as the most beautiful wedding dress anyone had seen. Ruth was in the cathedral. She was in the position that her decades of palace service had earned, not in the seats reserved for the principal family members, not at the center of the occasion, but present, as she had been present at every occasion of this significance for 30 years, in the space the institution assigned. She watched Diana walk up the aisle. She watched the marriage begin. She understood what she was watching in the way that no one else in the cathedral that morning understood it, with the specific combined knowledge of someone who knew Diana from the inside, and who knew the institution from the inside, and who had held both knowledges simultaneously for the preceding year, and had resolved the tension between them in the way the preceding year had shown her resolving it. The ceremony concluded. The couple appeared on the balcony. The crowd produced the sound that crowds produce at such moments. Ruth processed out of the cathedral with the people around her. She had done what the institution required of her. The question of what she had not done, what the grandmother had not done for the 19-year-old girl now married to the Prince of Wales in the most watched ceremony in history, was the question that would spend the following decade organizing itself into the specific form that Diana would eventually name publicly. The naming would come. Ruth would be alive to hear it. What she would do with the hearing is the subject that the next part of this account addresses. The marriage began to fail almost immediately. Not in the public sense. The public version of the marriage was carefully managed for years, through the official photographs and the joint appearances, and the choreographed presentation of a couple who were performing the role of royal newlyweds, with the institutional efficiency that the palace brought to the performance of all its significant public productions. The public version held for longer than the private version. The private version was failing within weeks. What Diana encountered inside the marriage was not what 19-year-olds who are in love with an idea encounter when they are still in the idea. It was the specific reality of a man who was 32 years old and who had been formed by 32 years of his specific life, which included a relationship with a woman named Camilla Parker Bowles that had been ongoing in various forms since the early 1970s, and that had not concluded because Diana had appeared and the wedding had happened. Diana did not know the full shape of this before the wedding. She knew pieces of it. She had found a bracelet that Charles had ordered for Camilla days before the wedding, with an engraving that was not ambiguous. She had raised it. The raising of it had been managed in the specific way that the palace managed things that complicated the outcome it was organizing toward. It was received, processed, and the processing produced no change in the trajectory toward the 29th of July. She had married him anyway, in the specific logic of someone who has been told by the entire management of the preceding months that this is what was happening, and who had not yet developed the interior resources to step outside the management and ask whether this was what she wanted. The interior resources developed, in Diana, across the first years of the marriage, in conditions that were not designed to produce them. She was in the palaces: Buckingham Palace, Kensington Palace, Highgrove, Balmoral, Sandringham, the specific institutional residences of the life she had entered, and she was inside them, in the particular way of someone who is present in a space, without the space being organized around her presence. The palaces were organized around the institution. The institution had requirements that did not include the emotional reality of a 20-year-old woman in her first year of marriage to a man who was in love with someone else. She was lonely in the specific and extreme way of someone who is surrounded by people and has no one. The bulimia began in the first weeks of the marriage. She talked about this later, in the specific direct language she had developed for talking about the things the institution preferred not to be talked about. The eating disorder as the body's response to what the mind could not contain. The purging as the physical expression of an interior situation that had no other form of expression available to it. She was bulimic for years. The people around her knew. The palace knew. The management of the knowledge was consistent with the management of everything else the palace found inconvenient. It was held in the interior of the institution, in the place where inconvenient things went, and it was not addressed in any way that would have required the institution to acknowledge that what was happening was serious and was related to the specific conditions the institution had created. Ruth knew. She was inside the institution. She was in the Queen Mother's orbit, which placed her in the specific web of information that the royal household's inner circle exchanged, through the channels that such circles have always used. Not formal briefings, not written communications, but the conversation of people who are present at the same occasions and who understand that information is both currency and responsibility, who share it accordingly. She knew Diana was struggling. She knew in the way of someone who had also, and this is the part of Ruth's knowledge that the coverage of her story rarely engages with, the personal knowledge of the person who was struggling. She had known Diana since birth. She had watched the child who had grown up in the fractured Spencer household, who had developed the emotional sensitivity that fractured households produce, who had not been given, by circumstances, by the divorce, by the specific emotional landscape of her formation, the kind of interior stability that would have made the extreme conditions of the early marriage navigable. She knew this child was in trouble. She did not go to her. The not going requires examination rather than simple condemnation, because Ruth Fermoy's failure toward Diana was not the failure of someone who was indifferent to Diana's suffering. The evidence suggests she was not indifferent. The evidence suggests she was aware and troubled and in possession of the specific discomfort of someone who holds two things simultaneously that cannot be held comfortably together. What she held was the knowledge of Diana's suffering and the knowledge of what the institutional response to Diana's suffering would be if she raised it, and the knowledge of what her own position within the institution would look like after she raised it. The institutional response to inconvenient personal information was the management of it toward the least disruptive outcome. The least disruptive outcome, in 1981 and 1982 and 1983, was the continuation of the marriage in the form the institution required it to take, which was the form of a functioning royal marriage, producing heirs to the throne and performing the public role with the consistency the public role demanded. William was born in June 1982, Harry in September 1984. The heirs arrived. The public performance continued. The institutional requirement for the marriage to function in the form it required was met. The private marriage was not the public marriage. Ruth could not raise the private marriage without threatening the public one. The public marriage was the institutional product. The institutional product was the thing Ruth's entire adult life had been organized around protecting. She did not raise it. What she did instead was something that is, in its specific form, characteristic of people who are in the position she was in, people who understand that something is wrong and who cannot or will not act on the understanding in the direct way the situation requires, and who express the understanding through indirect means that allow them to feel that they have done something without doing the thing that would actually change the situation. She was kind to Diana when she saw her. The kindness was real. Ruth was not a woman who performed warmth she did not feel, and the warmth she extended to Diana in the early years of the marriage was genuine in the way of someone who is genuinely fond of a person, and who is also, simultaneously, not going to act on the fondness in the way the fondness would require if the fondness were the primary commitment. The primary commitment was not the fondness. Diana received the kindness and found it insufficient in the specific way that people find kindness insufficient when what they need is advocacy. The kindness said, "I see you, I care about you, I am glad you exist." The advocacy would have said, "This situation is wrong, and I am going to do something about it." The distinction between the two is not subtle when you are the person who needs advocacy and is receiving kindness instead. Diana understood the distinction. She did not yet name it as clearly as she would eventually name it, but she understood it in the way of someone who has been given the wrong thing by the right person, who knows that the person is capable of more and is choosing to give less, and who is too young and too inside the situation to understand yet why. The palace, through these years, was managing Diana in the way the palace managed things that were more complicated than the management had anticipated. The complication was Diana herself. She was not, it turned out, the simple and biddable 19-year-old that the management had been organized around acquiring. She was a person whose interior landscape was, in fact, very large, larger than the inspection available before the marriage had revealed, larger than the brief courtship had allowed to become visible, larger than the institution had prepared itself to receive. The largeness expressed itself in ways the institution found difficult. She connected with people in the public who were not the people the institution typically connected with. She went toward the suffering, the sick, the dying, the people the formal royal visit was designed to acknowledge from a safe institutional distance. She held them. She looked at them directly. She gave them the specific quality of attention that she had learned in the Spencer household, and that the institutional training of the preceding years had not replaced with managed distance. The public responded to this with something that went beyond the ordinary public response to royalty. They responded with the specific warmth of people who feel seen by someone in a position that usually produces only the feeling of being observed. She was becoming, without designing it, and without the palace designing it, something the palace had not produced in a long time, and possibly had not produced before in this specific form, a royal figure whose public presence was not organized around the institution, but around herself, whose connection with the people who responded to her was personal rather than symbolic, whose significance derived from who she was rather than from the position she held. This was not what the institution had wanted. The institution had wanted a princess. It had gotten Diana. Ruth watched Diana become Diana through the early years of the marriage and through the middle years, and she watched with the specific ambivalence of someone who recognized what they were watching, who understood that the quality developing in her granddaughter was extraordinary, and that the situation the quality was developing inside was doing damage to the person whose quality it was. She watched, and she did not intervene, and she did not speak, and she continued her life as Lady Fermoy, as the lady-in-waiting to the Queen Mother, as the trusted interior member of the institution, whose trust was maintained by the same quality that had maintained it for 30 years. The absolute reliability of a woman who did not say the thing that would complicate the institutional management of the situation. The situation was being managed. The marriage was being managed. Diana was being managed. The managing was not working in the way that the managing of things sometimes does not work, when the thing being managed is a person rather than a situation, when the person has interior resources that the management has underestimated and that develop, through the pressure of the management, into something the management cannot contain. Diana's interior resources were developing. She was 21, 22, 23, 24, through the years of the early marriage, and she was developing in the specific accelerated way of someone whose circumstances impose demands that require development or destruction, and who finds, in themselves, something sufficient to meet the demands without being destroyed by them. She was not destroyed, she was changed, not into the person the institution had intended, not into the performing compliance of a princess who had learned that compliance was the available form of survival, but into something harder to manage and more genuinely herself than the management had been organized to produce. Ruth observed the development with the precise attention she brought to everything she observed. She understood what she was watching. She held the understanding in the place where her understandings had always gone, in the interior, in the private record, in the space between knowing and acting, where she had been living for decades, and that had become, by the 1980s, so thoroughly the space she inhabited, that the distance between knowing and acting felt not like a choice, but like a condition. It was a choice. She was making it every year. The years moved through the 1980s, and the marriage deteriorated in the private way that was not yet visible in the public version, and Ruth moved through them, beside the Queen Mother, and inside the institution, and the institution continued, and the marriage continued to be performed, in the form the performance required. Charles and Diana were photographed. They appeared at official occasions. They traveled together to the countries that expected them. They stood beside each other in the photographs, and the photographs were published, and the public received them as the evidence of a marriage that the private reality did not support. Ruth knew the private reality. She held it privately. The holding continued until it could no longer hold. The moment the private reality stopped being entirely private, arrived not as a single event, but as a sequence, the specific accumulation of pressures that institutional marriages contain when the institution is no longer sufficient to keep the private reality inside the private space where the institution needs it to stay. The sequence began with the book. Andrew Morton's biography of Diana, Diana, Her True Story, was published in June 1992. It was not, in its formal description, a book that Diana had cooperated with. It was described as a biography, drawing on sources close to the princess. This description was technically accurate and completely misleading, which was the specific quality of the description the palace had required in the negotiations around the book's publication. What the book actually was Diana's own account of her marriage, delivered through the specific mechanism of recorded interviews, conducted in secret, given to Andrew Morton, and used as the basis of the text. She had answered Morton's questions on tape, in the specific direct language that she had been developing for years, as her capacity to name what was happening to her developed alongside the happening. The tapes were real, and the account they contained was Diana's account, and it was damaging to the marriage, and to Charles, and to the institution, in the specific ways that first-person accounts of failed marriages are always more damaging than third-person ones. The damage was enormous. The palace's response was the response of an institution that has just had the private reality of one of its most significant members placed in the public record without the institutional management that would have processed it into something less damaging. It was furious, and it was managed in the specific way that institutional fury is managed, through channels, through statements, through the careful deployment of the available counter-narrative. The counter-narrative was that Diana was unstable, that her account was the account of someone whose grip on reality had been compromised by the eating disorder and the emotional difficulties that the palace had been managing since the early years of the marriage and that had never been resolved. That the book was the product of a woman in extremis rather than a woman giving an accurate account of her situation. The counter-narrative was also the counter-narrative that Ruth Fermoy was available to provide. She provided it. In 1992, in the months after the Morton book's publication, Ruth Fermoy gave an interview. The interview was not the kind of interview that people in her position typically gave. Lady-in-waitings did not give interviews. The institutional culture of the royal household was organized around the understanding that the people inside it did not speak to the press about the people they served. She gave one. She gave it with the specific purpose of providing the institutional counter-narrative about Diana. She said Diana was not suited for the position she occupied. She said the marriage had been difficult because Diana had been difficult. She used the specific language of the person who has the insider knowledge that makes their characterization authoritative, the grandmother, the person who had known Diana from birth, the person whose intimacy with the subject gave the counter-narrative its weight. Diana heard about the interview. The hearing of it produced the specific quality of pain that is produced when the person who has the most intimate knowledge of who you are uses that knowledge against you in the most public way available to them. Not a stranger's mischaracterization, which is painful in one way, not an enemy's attack, which is painful in another way. The person who had known her since she was born, who had been the grandmother, who had provided the warmth that was real, for as long as the warmth was not in conflict with the institutional priority. That person using the 30 years of knowing her as ammunition for the institutional management of the damage her honesty had caused. Diana did not respond publicly to the interview. She was, by 1992, sufficiently developed in her understanding of the institution to know that responding publicly would produce the specific cycle that the institution managed most efficiently: the statement, the counter-statement, the press amplification of both, the confusion of the public between two competing narratives, the conclusion that the confusion served the institution better than clarity would have served Diana. She did not respond publicly. She responded in the specific form she had always responded to things she could not address directly. She held the knowledge in the interior, she processed it over time, and she arrived, through the processing, at a clearer understanding of what had happened and why. The clearer understanding was that Ruth had always been choosing the institution, not occasionally, not in the specific moments when the choice was most visible, not only in 1992, when the interview made the choice explicit, always, from the beginning. From the moment in 1980, when Ruth had looked at the situation developing between Diana and Charles, and had possessed the specific knowledge that would have complicated the arrangement, and had not used it, through every year of the marriage, in which Diana had struggled in ways that Ruth's knowledge and Ruth's position could have addressed, and had not addressed, through 1992, when Ruth had gone to a journalist and provided the counter-narrative. Always choosing the institution. The clarity that Diana developed around this understanding was the clarity that she would eventually express publicly, in the Panorama interview, in the account she gave to Morton that had become the book, in the specific things she said about her grandmother that placed in the public record what the relationship had actually been. But in 1992, the clarity was still developing. Diana was 31 years old. She was in the final year of the marriage in its official form. The separation would be announced in December 1992, and she was in the process of becoming, with the specific acceleration that crisis produces in people who have the resources to be accelerated by crisis rather than broken by it, the person she would be in the years that followed. The person she was becoming was the person who did not need the institution's permission to say what was true. Ruth was 74 years old in 1992. She had been Lady Fermoy for 32 years. She had been at the center of the world the palace represented for longer than that. The friendship with the Yorks beginning in the 1930s and never ending. The presence at Sandringham and the Queen Mother's side through everything the decades had contained. She was also, by 1992, someone who was beginning to understand, in the specific way of people who have made choices they cannot unmake, and who are arriving at the age when the choices and their consequences are becoming the primary content of what remains, what the choices had been. She had understood, as early as 1980, that Diana was not suited for the role. She had endorsed the match regardless. She had held the knowledge for a year and had given the institution what the institution was looking for, rather than giving her granddaughter what her granddaughter needed. She was holding this knowledge in 1992, alongside the knowledge of the interview she had just given and what the interview had done. Did she regret it? The record does not say directly. Ruth Fermoy was not a woman who expressed regret directly, which was consistent with who she had always been, the interiority, the management of the private through the private channels, the not saying the thing that would complicate. Whether regret existed in the interior is in the interior, where Ruth kept everything that mattered most. What the record shows is behavior. The behavior after 1992 was different from the behavior before 1992 in one specific way that the biographical accounts document and that the people who knew Ruth in her final years have described. She became, in the years between the Morton book and her death in 1993, quieter about Diana. Not silent, she had made the statement she made, and the statement was in the record, and she did not retract it, but quieter. The specific quality of someone who has done something that cannot be undone, and who is living in the knowledge of the undoing. Whether the quietness was regret, or simply the management of the situation's new complexity, the record does not fully establish. What the record does establish is that Ruth Fermoy died in July 1993. She was 84 years old. She died at her home in King's Lynn, in Norfolk, not far from Park House, where she had raised her children on the Sandringham estate in the 1940s and 1950s. She died 14 months after the separation of Charles and Diana was announced, and 4 years before Diana's death in Paris. She did not live to see the Panorama interview, which was November 1995. She did not live to see the divorce, which was finalized in August 1996. She did not live to see the tunnel in Paris. She did not live to hear what Diana eventually said about her publicly. What Diana said, in the accounts she gave that reached the public record, in the Morton tapes, in the Panorama interview, in the things she said to the people around her who later described them, was that Ruth had known, that she had understood what the match would cost Diana, and had stayed silent because the palace mattered to her more than Diana did. This is Diana's account. It is the account of a woman who was in the situation and who had reason to understand it in terms that were not always generous to the people around her. It is also the account of a woman who had spent years developing the capacity to see clearly what had happened to her and why, and whose clarity, by the mid-1990s, was considerable. The account has not been substantially contradicted by the historical record. What the historical record shows is consistent with Diana's account. A woman who had the knowledge to act, and the position to act, and the relationship to act, and who did not act, repeatedly and across decades, because the acting would have required placing Diana's welfare above the institutional priority, and the institutional priority had always been where Ruth Fermoy organized herself. The question the account raises, not whether it is accurate, but what it means, is the question that this account has been building toward, and that the remaining parts will address. What it means is something about the specific form of harm that institutional loyalty produces when it becomes the organizing principle of the self so completely that the other loyalties, the loyalties of blood, of family, of the basic obligation that grandmothers have toward granddaughters, are subordinated to it without being extinguished by it. Ruth loved Diana. The love was real. The love and the choice were both real, simultaneously, in the same person, and the person managed both of them, in the interior, in the way she managed everything, privately, precisely, with the intelligence and the discipline that had made her exceptional at everything she had ever turned that intelligence and discipline toward. Exceptional at the piano, exceptional at the King's Lynn Festival, exceptional at being Lady Fermoy, not exceptional at being Diana's grandmother, when being Diana's grandmother required something that being Lady Fermoy would not permit. The failure was real. It was also not simple. Ruth Fermoy was not a villain. She was a woman whose formation had produced, through the specific accumulation of the choices that formation made available, a person who could not in the end locate a priority more important than the position she had spent her adult life building. This is a human failure rather than a monstrous one. It is also, in its specific consequences, for a specific 19-year-old who became a 20-year-old and a 30-year-old and who died in a Paris tunnel at 36, a significant one. The significance does not require Ruth to be monstrous to be acknowledged. It requires only the honest accounting of what she chose and what the choosing cost. Diana gave the Panorama interview on the 5th of November, 1995. Ruth was dead by then. She had been dead for 2 years and 4 months. She could not watch the broadcast, could not hear what Diana said to Martin Bashir, could not process the specific quality of what her granddaughter had become in the years since the marriage, and what the becoming had equipped her to say. Diana sat across from Bashir in a room at Kensington Palace, and she looked into the camera with the direct, unguarded quality that she had developed across 34 years of a life that had not always provided her with the luxury of guardedness, and she said true things. She said her marriage had contained a third person. She named the third person. She said the palace had not provided the support that the difficulties of the early years had required. She said she had not been well, and that the not being well had not been addressed in the ways it deserved to be addressed. She said she wanted to be a queen of people's hearts. She also said something about her family. She said that the people around her who had known what the match was likely to produce had not told her what they knew. She was not specific, in the Panorama interview, about which people she meant. She was specific in other contexts, in the Morton tapes, in the things she said to the people in her circle who later described them, in the gradual construction of her own account of her life that she was engaged in throughout the 1990s. In those other contexts, she was specific about Ruth. She said Ruth had known. She said Ruth had understood, in 1980 and 1981, that the match was wrong for Diana, and had not said so. She said the silence was the silence of a woman who had made a calculation, who had weighed what speaking would cost her position, and what silence would cost her granddaughter, and had concluded that the position mattered more. This is Diana's account. It is the account of a woman who had spent 15 years inside the consequences of the choices made around her in 1980 and 1981, and who had arrived, through 15 years of those consequences, at a clarity about those choices that the people who had made them had not publicly demonstrated. It is also an account that requires some engagement with what it does not contain, which is Ruth's interiority, the specific account of what Ruth knew and when, and what she thought about it, and whether the thinking produced anything that looked, in the interior, like regret. Ruth's interiority is not available. She kept it in the interior, as she had always kept it, and she took it with her in July 1993, and it is therefore permanently in the place where the things that people keep privately go when the people who kept them die. What is available is the behavior. The behavior tells its own story, and the story it tells is consistent with Diana's account in the ways that matter for the historical record. Ruth endorsed the match. Ruth did not warn Diana. Ruth gave the 1992 interview that provided the institutional counter-narrative against Diana. These are facts of behavior that do not require access to the interior to establish. The gap between the behavior and any alternative behavior, between what Ruth did and what someone in her position who had organized themselves around a different priority might have done, is the space in which Diana's account operates. What someone organized around Diana's welfare rather than the institution's priorities might have done in 1980, is not difficult to imagine. She might have gone to the relevant people and said what she knew, that Diana was not ready, that the courtship was too brief, that the position was too demanding for someone of Diana's age and formation. She might have said it to Charles. She might have said it to the Queen Mother. She might have said it to the people in the palace who were organizing the arrangement and who were consulting her, specifically, because she was the person with the most intimate knowledge of the subject. The consultation was happening because she was Ruth Fermoy. They were asking her about Diana because she knew Diana. They were waiting her opinion because she was the grandmother, the person who had watched Diana from birth, the person whose knowledge of the subject was personal and long and specific in ways that no other consulted person's knowledge was. She gave them the endorsement. She gave them what they were looking for, which was the confirmation that the person they wanted was suitable for the role they wanted to fill with her. The confirmation was the cost. Not the cost to Ruth, who paid nothing immediately visible for giving it. She remained Lady Fermoy, remained at the center of the world she had built, remained the trusted intimate of the Queen Mother, whose trust was maintained by the specific quality that had always maintained it. The cost to Diana, who entered the marriage with the endorsement of the person who knew her best, having decided not to say what the knowing contained. The endorsement was the harm, not simply the silence, the active provision of what the institution was looking for. The step from not warning to actively confirming, from declining to complicate the arrangement to providing the specific confirmation that helped close the arrangement, is the step that makes the failure more than a simple omission.
If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one.
Diana understood this distinction. She articulated it, in the accounts that reached the record, with the clarity of someone who has had 15 years to examine the specific shape of what happened to her, and who has found, in the examination, the exact point at which the person who could have changed things chose not to. The point was Ruth's endorsement. What Ruth said to herself about the endorsement, whether she framed it as loyalty to the institution, whether she framed it as a genuine belief that Diana would be suitable, whether she framed it as an absence of certainty about what she believed, rather than a presence of certainty about what she chose to suppress, is in the interior. What is not in the interior but in the record is what happened. Diana was endorsed. Diana married. Diana suffered. Ruth knew the suffering was happening. Ruth gave the 1992 interview that placed the suffering in a frame that served the institutional narrative rather than Diana's honest account of it. Diana's account eventually reached the public in the forms it reached the public. Ruth died before the forms had fully reached the public. The sequence is the story. The story does not require Ruth to have been calculating in a cold or cynical way. It requires only that she was someone for whom the institutional priority had become, through 30 years of consistent application, the default priority, the first consideration, the organizing principle, the thing that the other things were arranged around, rather than one consideration among others. The default priority produced the default response. The default response was the institutional one. Diana paid the cost of the default response for the 15 years between the wedding and the tunnel in Paris. Ruth died 4 years before the tunnel, in the specific timing that means she was not alive to see where the story ended, not alive to have her understanding of what she had done tested against the final and most definitive evidence of what it had cost. She died in 1993. Diana died in 1997. The 4 years between those two deaths are the 4 years in which Diana became most fully herself in public, in which the clarity she had been developing across the 15 years of the marriage and the separation found its most complete expression, in which she used the platform of the position she occupied to do the specific work that the position had never been designed to accommodate and that she was doing anyway, in which the queen of people's hearts that she said she wanted to be in the Panorama interview became, in the living and the doing of it, real. Ruth did not see this. The biographers who have written about Ruth Fermoy, and the people who knew her in the final years of her life, describe someone who was, in the months before her death, quieter than she had been. Not visibly distressed, Ruth was not a person who expressed distress visibly. and the formation of a lifetime was not going to be undone in the final year, but quieter, more interior, in the specific condition of someone for whom the accounting of a life is presenting itself in the accumulated form that final years present such things. The accounting contained what it contained. It contained the King's Lynn festival, which was real, and which lasted, and which she had built from nothing into something significant. It contained the 32 years of service to the Queen Mother, which were real, and which had been given with genuine devotion, rather than mere calculation. It contained the decades of genuine warmth toward the people she had been warm toward, which had been real, even when the warmth was organized around the institutional priority, rather than existing independently of it. It also contained 1980, and 1981, and the years between, and 1992. Whether the accounting produced, in the interior, the specific recognition of what those years contained, whether Ruth Fermoy, in the final months of her life, understood what her choices had done to Diana, and felt, about the understanding, the thing that the understanding warranted, is not in the record. The record shows only that she died in July 1993, in Norfolk, at 84 years old, with the accounting in the interior where she had always kept it, and where it remained permanently after her death. Diana was alive. Diana was 32 years old. Diana was in the specific territory of someone who has been through what she had been through, and who has found, on the other side of it, a clarity and a capacity and a genuine sense of what she wanted her life to be. She wanted it to be the thing that the institution had not designed, and that she was making anyway. The Queen of Hearts, the person who went toward the suffering, rather than away from it. The woman who had been formed by everything that had happened to her, in ways that produced, not despite the forming but through it, someone whose presence in the world was genuinely and substantially useful to the people it touched. Ruth had known this person when she was a child. She had watched her become this person across the years of the marriage, in the conditions the marriage provided, which were conditions that damaged people or developed them, and which had developed Diana in ways that Ruth, who possessed the intelligence to see clearly, had clearly seen. She had seen the developing, and she had held it alongside the institutional priority, and she had continued to choose the institutional priority, up to and including the 1992 interview, and the choosing had been consistent across the years in the way that the choices of people who are organized around a single priority are consistent. The consistency was the portrait. The portrait is what Ruth left. Not only the King's Lynn festival, not only the 32 years of service, the portrait of a woman whose formation had produced a specific kind of loyalty that was total toward the institution and conditional toward the people whose welfare the institution did not prioritize. Diana was the most visible person whose welfare the institution did not prioritize. Ruth's relationship to Diana was the clearest illustration of what that loyalty looked like from the outside. From the outside, it looked like a grandmother who chose the palace over her granddaughter. Diana said this. She was right. The question of whether Ruth Fermoy understood what she was doing, whether the choices she made across the years of Diana's life were the choices of someone who knew clearly what they were choosing and chose nonetheless, or whether the institutional formation had produced in her a blindness to the full shape of the choosing, is the question that this part of the account is organized around. It is not a question the record answers cleanly. What the record shows is behavior, and the behavior is consistent with either interpretation. The woman who endorses a match she knows is wrong, who maintains the institutional narrative against her granddaughter's honest account, who gives the 1992 interview, this woman could be someone who knows exactly what she is doing and has decided the institutional priority outweighs the personal cost. She could also be someone who has organized herself around the institutional priority so completely that the full personal cost is not visible to her in the way it would be visible to someone whose organizing principle was different. The distinction matters for how we understand Ruth. It does not change what she did. It changes how we understand the doing. The institutional formation that Ruth had undergone across 30 years as Lady Fermoy was not simply training in a set of behaviors. It was something more fundamental, the reorganization of the self around the institution's requirements in ways that made the institutional view the default view, the institutional priority the default priority. The institutional interpretation of events, the default interpretation. People who have been formed this way do not typically experience their institutional choices as choices. They experience them as what is right, as the obvious, natural, correct response to the situation, which happens also to be the institutional response. The question of whether they are choosing or whether they are simply doing what seems right to someone, organized the way they are organized, is the question that makes the institutional formation more difficult to evaluate morally than deliberate calculation would be. Deliberate calculation is culpable in a clear way. You know what you are doing, and you do it anyway, and the knowing makes the doing a choice with full moral weight. The institutional formation is more complicated. You do what seems right. What seems right is the institutional response. The institutional response is organized around the institutional priority. The institutional priority has, over decades, become indistinguishable from your own priority. The question of whether you could have seen it differently, whether the blindness was culpable or structural, is the question that makes judgment harder without making it unnecessary. Ruth was an intelligent woman. She was, by every account of the people who knew her, and by the evidence of what she accomplished, genuinely and seriously intelligent. She had the ability to see clearly and to analyze accurately and to understand what she was looking at. These were not qualities that the institutional formation had suppressed in her. They were qualities she brought to the service of the institution, and that the institution valued precisely because they were genuine. The question is whether intelligence of the kind Ruth possessed could have produced, alongside the institutional view, a genuine understanding of what Diana's situation actually was, and if so, why the genuine understanding did not produce different behavior. There are two possible answers. The first is that the institutional formation was sufficient to suppress the full weight of the genuine understanding, that Ruth knew Diana was in trouble, knew the match was wrong, but experienced the knowing through the filter of the institutional priority in a way that reduced the knowing to something manageable, rather than something requiring action. The second is that Ruth knew fully and chose fully, that there was no filter, that the institutional priority was not a distortion of her view, but a clear-eyed expression of it, that she made a decision with complete understanding of what the decision cost, and decided the cost was acceptable in exchange for the institutional position she maintained. The truth is probably neither of these cleanly. The truth is probably the more complicated thing, that the institutional formation had produced in Ruth a woman who experienced both things simultaneously without fully resolving the tension between them, who knew more than the institutional response required her to acknowledge, and acknowledged less than what she knew, who lived in the gap between the knowing and the acknowledging in the specific way of people for whom the gap is not comfortable, but is more comfortable than closing it. The gap was the interior. The interior was where she kept what the institutional response did not require. She kept Diana's actual situation there. She kept the knowledge of what the match would cost there. She kept the 1992 interview there, in the space between doing it and understanding fully what the doing contained. The interior is where all of it went. The interior is where it remained. This is what the institutional formation does to people who give themselves to it completely. It does not eliminate the personal knowledge, the family feeling, the awareness of the human situation that exists alongside the institutional one. It provides, instead, the specific interior space where all of that lives, managed and held, and never quite acted upon in the way it would be acted upon if the organizing principle were different. Ruth had that interior space. She used it. She kept Diana in it, in the private and genuine warmth of a grandmother who loved her grandchild and who did not allow that love to complicate the institutional priority that organized everything around it. Diana, in her own account of what this felt like from the receiving end, described it as coldness, as the palace mattering more than she did, as the grandmother choosing the institution over the granddaughter. This is accurate as a description of the outcome. It is not entirely accurate as a description of what was happening inside Ruth. What was happening inside Ruth was not coldness. It was something more painful than coldness, in the specific way that situations are more painful when the feeling is present and not acted on than when the feeling is simply absent. She felt the warmth. She managed it inside the institutional priority. She produced, on the outside, what the institutional priority required: the endorsement, the silence, the 1992 interview, while keeping in the interior the warmth that the outside did not show. Diana received the outside. The outside looked like the palace mattering more. The outside was the palace mattering more, even if the interior contained something different. The distinction between what was in the interior and what was produced on the outside is not a distinction that helped Diana. What helped or harmed Diana was the outside, the behaviors, the choices, the specific things Ruth did and did not do across the years of the marriage and the years before it. The interior is relevant only for understanding Ruth. Understanding Ruth requires holding both things, the genuine warmth and the institutional priority, without allowing either to cancel the other, without making her simply a monster who never loved her granddaughter, and without making her simply a devoted grandmother who was helplessly caught in institutional forces beyond her control. She was neither. She was a woman who loved Diana and chose the institution, and the choosing was a choice, and the choice was consistent and sustained across decades. And the consistency of the choosing across decades is the evidence that the choosing was not helpless but preferred. The preference is the judgment, not the failure to love. The preference, given both the love and the institutional priority, for the institutional priority. This is the specific form of the harm that the institutional formation of Ruth Fermoy produced, not the absence of love, the presence of love alongside the absence of the willingness to act on it in ways that would have cost the institutional position. Diana knew both were present. She knew she was loved and that the love was insufficient to produce what she needed, and she articulated this in her account of her grandmother with the clarity of someone who has understood that the insufficiency of love, when love is not the organizing principle, is the most honest description of what a certain kind of failure looks like. Love is not always enough. Love organized around something else is not enough when the something else is more important than the love to the person doing the organizing. Ruth's love was organized around the institution. The institution was more important to her than the love. The love was real. The love being real did not make it enough. Diana understood this. She said so. The saying of it was, in the accounts available, not bitter in the simple sense of bitterness, not organized around the feeling of having been wronged by someone who should have done better. It was more specifically sad. The sadness of someone who has understood that a person who loved them chose something else, and who has had enough time with the understanding to have moved past the first form of the sadness into the settled form that remains when the processing is done. Diana had processed it. She understood Ruth. The understanding did not excuse the choices. The choices had produced consequences that Diana had lived inside for 15 years, and the consequences were real, and were lasting, and were, in their cumulative effect on the person who bore them, significant. The significance is the third thing this account has been building toward, alongside the understanding of who Ruth was and the understanding of what she chose. The significance is what the story of Ruth Fermoy reveals about the institution she served, about what the institution does to the people who give themselves to it completely, and about what those people do, in turn, to the people around them whose welfare the institution does not prioritize. Ruth gave herself to the institution completely. The institution received what she gave and used it for its own purposes, and continued. Diana bore the cost of what the giving and the using produced. This is the structure of the story. The structure is not unique to Ruth Fermoy and Diana. It is the structure that this account has traced, across the different figures it has described, in the royal family's relationship to the people within it and around it, the taking of what is given, without the accounting of the cost, the maintenance of the institutional priority at the expense of the individuals the priority overrides, the production of institutional outcomes through the management of individual people in ways that the institution never examines because the examination would require it to ask whether the outcomes justify the cost. Ruth Fermoy is the clearest example of this structure from the inside. The clearest example of a person who was so completely formed by the institution that the institutional priority became her priority and she served it accordingly, including against the people she loved. Crawford is the clearest example from the outside. the clearest example of a person who served the institution and was discarded when the service was no longer needed. Townsend and Margaret are the clearest example of the institution managing the people inside it, in the service of its own requirements, at the cost of the people managed. Princess Michael is the clearest example of the institution managing the person who cannot be fully managed. Tiggy is the clearest example of the person who gave something the institution needed and received nothing the institution was capable of giving. Each case adds to the same account. The account is of an institution that has been taking what it needs from the people in its orbit for centuries, without the accounting of the taking, without the examination of the cost, without the acknowledgement that the people from whom it takes are people, rather than institutional resources. Ruth Fermoy is the case that makes the taking most personal, because the taking was not only from Ruth. Through Ruth, the institution took something from Diana. It took the advocate she should have had, the grandmother who knew her and knew the institution, and who could have said, to the relevant people, what needed to be said. The saying would not have guaranteed a different outcome. The institution had decided what it wanted and had the power to pursue it. The saying might not have stopped the wedding, but the saying would have been the saying. The silence was the silence. The silence was Ruth's choice. The choice was produced by the institutional formation that Ruth had undergone across 30 years of being Lady Fermoy. The formation was the institution's product. The institution does not examine this. The account examines it here. Diana died on the 31st of August, 1997, in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris, at 36 years old. She had been in the car with Dodi Fayed, who also died, and with the driver Henri Paul, who also died, and with a bodyguard named Trevor Rees-Jones who survived. The car had been pursued by photographers on motorcycles and had entered the tunnel at a speed that the specific combination of the driver's blood alcohol level and the photographer's pursuit and the tunnel's own geometry had made catastrophic. The impact was against the 13th pillar of the tunnel, and the impact was at a speed that bodies do not survive intact. Diana did not survive. She died in the early morning hours in the Pitié-Salpêtrière hospital, surrounded by French medical staff who had done everything available to them and for whom everything available was not sufficient. The world received the news over the following hours in the specific way that news of this magnitude is received, first as a rumor, then as an unconfirmed report, then as the confirmed thing, which arrived differently in each person who received it, because the confirmed thing had a different relationship with each person's specific interior history of Diana. Ruth was dead. She had been dead for 4 years. She did not receive the news. She was not there for the things that the 4 years between her death and Diana's death had contained. Not there for the panorama interview. Not there for the divorce. Not there for the final chapter of Diana's life, in which Diana had finally, completely, in the fullest possible sense, become the person that the formation of the preceding 36 years had produced. The person Diana had become in those final years was the most complete version of herself available, not because her life was settled or her situation was simple, not because the pain of what had happened had been entirely processed into something that produced only clarity, but because she had arrived at a relationship with who she was and what she was doing with who she was that was more honest and more complete than any previous version. She was doing things. The charitable work that had begun as the performance of the princess's role had become, across the years of the marriage and the separation and the divorce, something different, something that was hers rather than the institution's, that she pursued with the specific urgency of someone who has found the form of engagement with the world that matches who they actually are, rather than who the institutional requirement needed them to be. The landmines campaign. She walked through the minefields. She sat with the survivors. She was photographed in the places that the official version of royal engagement did not include, in the specific physical presence of the consequence of something that the political world was organized around not addressing, and that she was addressing anyway, with the full force of the specific public platform that her 15 years inside the institution had given her. The platform was the institution's product. What she did with it was not. She used the institution's product in service of the people the institution did not serve. This is the specific irony of Diana's story, that the institution's decision to acquire her, to manage the courtship, and endorse the match and process her through the machinery of becoming the Princess of Wales, had produced, through the specific and costly path of everything it put her through, a person whose public capacity to do good exceeded what the institution had designed the position to produce. The institution had wanted a princess. It had produced something else entirely. Ruth had been one of the mechanisms of the production, not intentionally. The endorsement in 1980 had not been intended to produce Diana as she was in 1997, had not been intended to produce anything except the specific institutional outcome the institution was organizing toward. The producing of Diana as she was in 1997 was the unintended consequence of everything the institution did in the service of the intended outcome. This is the thing about institutions that is most difficult to see from inside them, that the outcomes they intend and the outcomes they produce are not always the same thing, and that the gap between them is sometimes very large, and that the people inside the institution are organized around the intended outcome in ways that make the actual outcome, when it is different from the intended one, difficult to process. The palace's intended outcome was a compliant princess. The actual outcome was Diana. Ruth had contributed to the actual outcome through the same act that had been intended to contribute to the intended outcome. The endorsement that was supposed to help produce a compliant princess had helped produce the opposite, had helped put into the position someone who was not compliant and who used the non-compliance to do things the institution had not intended her to do. This is not a justification of the endorsement. The endorsement was wrong regardless of what it produced, because the wrongness of endorsing something you know is wrong is not determined by the consequences but by the act. Ruth knew the match was not right for Diana. She endorsed it. The fact that the match ultimately produced someone who transformed the position is not evidence that the endorsement was right. It is evidence that people are not predictable in the ways that institutional management assumes they are. Diana was not predictable. Ruth had known this about her, had known from watching Diana grow up that she was not the simple, biddable product of the Spencer household and the specific world they moved in, but something larger and more complicated and less easily managed than the institutional assessment of a 19-year-old who met the basic requirements had recognized. She had known and had endorsed anyway. The endorsement was made on the basis of the institutional requirements, which Diana met. The endorsement was not made on the basis of the personal knowledge, which would have complicated it. The personal knowledge was in the interior. The interior did not determine the endorsement. The endorsement determined what happened to Diana. What happened to Diana was everything this account has traced: the marriage, the eating disorder, the loneliness, the development in difficult conditions, the panorama interview, the Morton book, the divorce, the final years, the tunnel. The tunnel was the end of the story in the literal sense. In the other sense, in the sense of what the story means and what it leaves in the record, and what the record reveals about the institution and the people who serve it, the story does not end in the tunnel. It continues in the accounts of the people who were inside it and who have spoken about it, and in the accounts like this one that try to assemble what the record shows into something that says clearly what it contains. What it contains, in the specific case of Ruth Fermoy, is the portrait of a woman whose service to the institution was complete and genuine, and whose completeness produced in her a specific incapacity, the incapacity to place the welfare of her granddaughter above the welfare of the institution when the two came into conflict. The conflict came. She chose the institution. Diana paid. This is the portrait. The portrait is not simple. Ruth was not simple. The institution is not simple. Diana was not simple. The specific combination of people and institution and formation and loyalty and love, and the choices made under the pressure of all of them, produces something that is not simple and that resists the simple frames that the coverage tends to impose on it. The coverage has tended to impose one of two simple frames. The first is the frame of the villain, Ruth, as the cold grandmother who sacrificed her granddaughter for position, whose love was false or absent, whose choices reflected the absence of genuine feeling toward Diana. The second is the frame of the victim, Ruth as the woman who was so completely formed by the institution that she had no genuine choice, whose behavior was the behavior of someone who had been so thoroughly colonized by the institutional priority that her own agency was, in the relevant moments, not meaningfully present. Neither frame is accurate. Ruth was not cold. The love was real. The warmth was genuine. The grandmother who found Diana interesting from childhood and who responded to Diana's quality of attention with the warmth that quality of attention always produced in the people it touched, was a real person expressing real feeling. Ruth was not without agency. The choices she made, the endorsement, the silence, the 1992 interview, were choices. They were made by a person who understood what she was doing well enough to do it consistently across decades, which is the evidence that the doing was purposeful rather than helpless. She was a person who loved her granddaughter and who chose, consistently and purposefully, the institutional priority over the expression of that love in the forms the love required when the forms of the love conflicted with the institutional priority. This is the accurate portrait. It is also the most difficult portrait to hold, because it requires holding the warmth and the choice simultaneously, without allowing either to make the other disappear. Diana held it. She held both things, the love that she knew was there and the choice that she knew had been made, and she arrived at a place of understanding that was clear without being simple, that acknowledged the love without being consoled by it, that named the choice without making it the whole of who Ruth was. She said Ruth had chosen the palace over her. She was right. She also, in the accounts of the people who knew her in the final years, spoke about Ruth without the undiluted bitterness that simple betrayal would have produced. She spoke about her with the complexity of someone who has understood a complicated person and has found, in the understanding, something that is neither forgiveness nor condemnation, but the more honest thing, the accurate seeing of someone who chose wrongly, and whose wrong choosing was the product of a specific formation in a specific institution that produced specific kinds of incapacity alongside genuine qualities. Diana saw clearly. She usually did, in the final years. The seeing clearly was one of the things the formation had produced in her, the specific capacity for accurate perception that the difficult conditions of her life had developed, that the institution had inadvertently produced by putting her through what it put her through, that she had eventually used to see the institution itself clearly. She saw Ruth clearly. She saw the institution clearly. She died before the full consequences of the seeing could be worked out in the world. What died with her was not the seeing. The seeing had already been expressed, in the Morton book, in the Panorama interview, in the accounts she gave to the people around her. What died with her was the ongoing application of the seeing to the future that the seeing would have continued to illuminate. The future without Diana has been 30 years now. The institution is still there. The institution does not examine the portrait of Ruth Fermoy, does not engage with the specific case it represents of a person so formed by the institutional priority that the institutional priority overrode the obligations of family and love, does not ask whether the formation the institution produces in the people who give themselves to it is the kind of formation that should be examined. It continues, the examination is here, the portrait is here, the honest accounting is here, not the simple frame of villainy, not the exculpating frame of helplessness, but the true portrait of a woman who loved her granddaughter and chose the palace and paid nothing for the choosing and left Diana to pay instead. The palace got what it wanted. Ruth kept what she had. Diana paid what was owed. This is the accounting. It is the only accounting that the situation actually produced. Frances Shand Kidd was alive through all of it. This is the fact that the account of Ruth Fermoy has consistently held at its edges without fully engaging with, that the woman Ruth had chosen against in 1967, in the custody dispute that gave Johnny Spencer the children, and gave Frances the specific grief of a mother who has lost the daily life of her own children, was alive through the engagement and the wedding and the marriage and the Morton book and the 1992 interview and Ruth's death in 1993 and Diana's death in 1997. Frances watched her mother choose the institution over Diana the same way Frances had watched her mother choose the institution over Frances. The parallel is not perfect. The specific form of the institutional priority was different in the two cases. In 1967, it expressed itself through the social code of the world they moved in, the code that said women who left their husbands for other men had violated the arrangement and should bear the consequences. In 1980, it expressed itself through the literal palace priority, the institutional machine of the royal household that Ruth served, and that she served above the welfare of her granddaughter. The form was different, the structure was the same. Ruth chose the institutional or social priority over the actual person, over Francis in 1967, over Diana in 1980. She made the choice using the same organizing principle, the same default priority, the same management of the private knowledge through the interior space where inconvenient knowing went when acting on it would cost the position. Francis understood this. She had understood it since 1967, when Ruth's testimony had contributed to the custody outcome that left Francis in Scotland with Peter Shand Kidd and the children at Park House with Johnny Spencer. She had processed the understanding across the years between 1967 and 1980, across the years of trying to maintain the relationship with her daughters from the distance the custody arrangement imposed, across the years of building a new life in the specific territory available to a woman of her class and generation who had left one marriage and entered another, and who was carrying the specific cost of both the leaving and the entering. The cost was the children. She had her children in the forms that the custody arrangement permitted: the holidays, the weekends, the phone calls, the sustained effort of presence at a distance that mothers who are not the primary parent construct from the available materials. She had them in these forms across the years of their childhood and into their adulthood, and the forms were real, and the relationship was real, but the forms were not the forms she had wanted, or the relationship, the full relationship that living with them daily would have provided. Ruth had contributed to the forms being what they were. Francis knew this, and lived with the knowledge in the way of someone who has had a long time to organize their interior life around something that cannot be changed, but that remains a permanent feature of the interior landscape, regardless of the organizing. The interior landscape of Francis Shand Kidd, in the years between 1967 and 1980, was not simple. She loved her mother. Ruth was not a woman who was easy to love. The specific combination of the intelligence and the precision and the institutional priority could produce, in close family proximity, the experience of being beside someone whose warmth was real, and whose engagement with you was genuine, and who was simultaneously organized around something that was not you, in ways that made the engagement feel conditional, even when it was warm. Francis had grown up inside this experience. She understood it in the specific way of a daughter who has had decades to understand her mother, not through analysis primarily, but through the accumulated texture of being known and not fully chosen, of being loved and not quite being the first thing. The first thing had always been the position. In Francis's childhood, it had been the position her mother was building, the cultivation of the connection to the royal family, the specific management of the friendship between the Fermoys and the Yorks that had produced the Park House arrangement, and that had been sustained through the decades by Ruth's social intelligence and her commitment to being exactly what the relationship required. In Francis's adulthood, it had been the position her mother occupied, the lady-in-waiting, the trusted insider, the woman whose proximity to the Queen Mother was the organizing principle of her later decades. Francis had watched her mother occupy this position for 30 years. She had watched her from the distance that Scotland imposed and that Ruth's choices had contributed to imposing. She had watched her mother's relationship with the royal family continue and deepen and become more central, while her own relationship with her mother remained at the edge of what the institutional centrality permitted. Then Diana had entered the picture. Francis knew Diana in the way that mothers know daughters. Not perfectly, not without the specific distortions that the relationship between mothers and daughters always contains, but from the inside, from the years of proximity that the custody arrangement had reduced but not eliminated. She knew Diana was not suited for what was being arranged, not in the way Ruth knew. Ruth's knowledge was the knowledge of someone who understood both the institution and the person. Francis's knowledge was the knowledge of the person who knew the person, who understood what the specific combination of Diana's emotional sensitivity and the damage of the Spencer household had produced, what Diana needed in a relationship and what she could not sustain without, what the specific vulnerabilities were that the institution's management of the courtship was not designed to account for. She raised concerns. This is in the record, not prominently, not in the form of a dramatic intervention, but in the accounts of the period that describe Francis as someone who expressed hesitation about the arrangement, who said to the relevant people that the timing was fast and Diana was young and the situation deserved more care than it was receiving. The hesitation was registered and processed in the way that hesitations are processed when the institution has decided what it wants. Acknowledged, considered, and continued past. Frances was not Lady Fermoy. She was not inside the institution in the way that gave her concerns the institutional weight that Ruth's concerns would have had. She was the mother, which gave her the personal weight, but the personal weight was not the institutional weight, and in the management of the arrangement toward the outcome the institution was organizing toward. The institutional weight was what mattered. Ruth's institutional weight would have mattered. Ruth did not use it on Diana's behalf. Frances watched the wedding from the position her life had placed her in, not estranged from Diana, not absent from the occasion, but present in the form that the specific history of the divorce and the custody and the specific character of her relationship with both the Spencers and the Fermoys had produced. She was Diana's mother. She was in St. Paul's Cathedral on the 29th of July 1981. She watched her daughter walk up the aisle. The accounts of people who were near Frances that day describe a woman who was composed in the specific way of composed people at moments of great feeling, who had organized herself around the requirements of the occasion, which were the requirements of the mother of the bride at the wedding of the century, and who was producing what the occasion required while holding in the interior what the interior contained. What the interior contained was not uncomplicated. She was glad for Diana in the ways that mothers are glad for daughters, in the direct, unconditioned way of love that wants the loved person to have good things. The wedding looked like a good thing from the outside, and Frances was on the outside of enough things in Diana's life that the outside view was frequently what she had. She was also, and the accounts of the people around her suggest this without specifying it, afraid. The fear was the fear of a woman who had watched the arrangement develop and had said what she thought about it and had not been heard, who understood something about what the institution produced in the people it processed, and who was watching her daughter being processed. She knew the institution. Not from the inside, not in the way that Ruth knew it from 30 years of being Lady Fermoy. From the outside, from the specific outside of someone who had grown up on the Sandringham estate, who had been raised in the proximity of the royal family, who had watched her mother organize her life around the institutional priority, and who had experienced what the organizing produced when it produced it against her. She knew what institutions did to people they considered peripheral. Diana was not going to be peripheral to this institution. Diana was going to be at its center. The center was a different kind of demanding from the edge. Frances was afraid of what the center would demand. She had reason. The marriage began, and the marriage deteriorated in the ways this account has described, and Frances watched it deteriorate from the distance that the arrangement imposed, from Scotland, from the phone calls, from the visits that the relationship permitted, and that gave her access to Diana in the forms available rather than the forms she would have chosen. She knew Diana was struggling. A mother knows. Not always specifically, not always with the precision of someone who is daily present, but in the general way of the sustained relationship between a mother and a daughter who have maintained their connection across the distance and the difficulty, in the quality of the voice on the phone, in the things said and not said, in the specific texture of what Diana communicated when they were together. Frances knew. She also knew what Ruth knew, that the institutional management of Diana's situation was not organized around Diana's welfare, but around the institutional priority, which was the maintenance of the marriage in the form the institution required. She could not fix this from Scotland. She tried to be the thing available to be from Scotland, which was the mother who picked up the phone and who was there in the form the phone permitted. She tried to give Diana what Diana needed in the forms available. The forms available were not the forms needed. Diana needed an advocate inside the institution, someone who understood both the institution and her, who could say to the relevant people what needed to be said, who had the specific combination of institutional position and personal knowledge that would have given the advocacy weight. Ruth had the specific combination. Ruth did not use it for Diana. Frances did not have the specific combination. She had the personal knowledge without the institutional position. She could speak from love, but love without institutional position in the specific world the royal family occupied was not the kind of speaking that changed things. She was Diana's mother, and she could not give Diana the thing that would have made the difference. The thing that would have made the difference was Ruth. Ruth chose not to make the difference. Frances lived inside this knowledge for years, the knowledge of what her mother had and what her mother chose not to do with what she had, placed alongside the knowledge of what Diana's situation was and what it required. The combination produced, in Frances, something that is not adequately described as bitterness toward Ruth. The relationship between a daughter and a mother who has made choices the daughter cannot endorse is more complicated than bitterness, is threaded through with the specific persistence of love that does not resolve cleanly into either the affection of simple warmth or the cleaner feeling of having been simply wronged. She loved her mother. Her mother had chosen against her in 1967 and had chosen against Diana in 1980 and had continued to choose against Diana through the years of the marriage and had died in 1993 with the choices in the interior where she kept everything that mattered, and Frances had watched all of it and continued to love her mother in the complicated way of someone for whom the love is not the problem. The love was never the problem. The problem was what the love did not prevent. Ruth died in July 1993. Frances was 56 years old. She had her mother for 56 years, not always in the form she needed, not always with the priority she deserved, but present for 56 years in the specific way that Ruth was present in the lives of the people she loved, which was the way of someone who gave genuinely within the constraints of the institutional priority and who could not give beyond those constraints. She mourned her, not simply with the specific complexity of someone who has understood a person across 56 years and who mourns the person they understood rather than the simpler version of the person that grief sometimes produces. Diana was 32 when Ruth died. The 4 years between Ruth's death and Diana's death were the 4 years of Diana's most complete becoming: the landmines, the panorama interview, the divorce, the final chapter. Ruth did not see them. Frances saw them. She saw Diana in those years in the forms available: the phone calls, the meetings, the specific texture of the relationship between a mother and a daughter who were navigating the aftermath of everything the preceding decades had contained. She saw Diana becoming the person the formation of those decades had produced. She saw the clarity Diana was developing about what had happened to her and why. She heard, as the person closest to Diana, who was also closest to Ruth, what Diana said about Ruth. The saying was not simple. It was not the simple condemnation of someone who has been straightforwardly wronged by someone who did not care. It was the more complicated saying of someone who understood the warmth and named the choice and held both without requiring either to cancel the other. Frances understood what Diana was saying because Frances had been saying something similar about the same woman since 1967. The two accounts, Frances's account of Ruth in the custody dispute and Diana's account of Ruth in the marriage, were different in their specific form and continuous in their essential structure. In both accounts, Ruth had known what the situation actually was and had chosen the institutional priority over the welfare of the person who needed her advocacy. In both accounts, the person who needed the advocacy had paid the cost of the choice. Frances had paid it in the forms of the custody arrangement across the years of her daughter's childhoods. Diana had paid it in the marriage and its consequences across the years of her adult life. Ruth had held it in the interior. The interior was where it remained. Frances outlived Diana. She was alive when Diana died in Paris in August 1997. She was alive for the phone call or the news broadcast or whatever form the most incomprehensible news takes when it arrives. The news that the daughter you have been trying to reach across the specific distance of decades is no longer reachable in any form because the distance has become permanent. She was in Scotland. She mourned in the way that is not describable, because the mourning of a parent for a child who has died before them is its own category of experience, not the mourning of grief that moves through stages towards something that functions as resolution. but the mourning that simply continues, without resolution, in the specific permanent form of an absence that does not become normal, no matter how long the not normal persists. She mourned Diana. She also, in the mourning of Diana, mourned what Ruth had not done, the conversation that had not happened, the advocacy that had not been given, the thing that a different woman organized around a different priority might have provided, and that the specific combination of Ruth and the institution, and the choices they produced together, had not provided. She had watched two people fail Diana. Charles was one, Ruth was the other. Charles's failure is the more documented one. It has been the subject of the major biographical accounts, and the dramatizations, and the coverage that continues to accumulate around the question of what the marriage actually was, and who was responsible for its being what it was. Ruth's failure is the less documented one. It sits at the edge of the major accounts, present in Diana's own words, and in the biographical literature, and in the specific record of what Ruth did and did not do, but not at the center of the cultural conversation about Diana in the way that Charles's failures are at the center. The account has been trying to bring it to the center for 9 parts. The center is where it belongs. Not because Ruth's failure was more significant than Charles's in its direct effect on Diana. Charles's failure was daily and sustained, and had the specific cruelty of the intimate relationship in which the intimacy is used against the person who trusted the intimacy. Ruth's failure was more distant in its form, but Ruth's failure was the one that was most preventable in the simplest sense, the sense that the person committing it had the specific combination of knowledge and position and relationship that could have produced a different outcome if organized around a different priority. She had everything required to advocate for Diana. She had the grandmother relationship. She had the knowledge of who Diana was. She had the institutional position that gave the knowledge weight. She chose not to use any of it in Diana's service. Frances knew this. Frances carried it. Frances is still alive as of this account's compilation. She is in her late 80s, in Scotland, having lived a life that contained everything this account has described and the decades beyond it. She has spoken occasionally about her mother. The speaking has the quality of the late-life engagement with difficult things, not the urgent clarity of someone still in the middle of the situation, but the settled, processed understanding of someone who has had decades to examine what happened and who has arrived at a relationship with the examination that functions, if not as peace, as something stable enough to speak from. She has spoken about Diana with the love of a mother who lost a daughter at 36. She has spoken about Ruth with the complicated love of a daughter who understood her mother and who did not entirely forgive her and who loves her anyway, because love in family relationships is frequently not contingent on forgiveness in the way that the simpler accounts of such relationships suggest. The love and the not forgiving coexist. They are both Frances's. They are both about Ruth. They are both true. The King's Lynn Festival is still running. It runs every summer in the historic market town on the Norfolk coast, in the churches and the guild halls and the specific medieval architecture that makes the town an unusual setting for serious music. Unusual in the sense of unexpected, the combination of the commercial port history and the aristocratic proximity and the East Anglian landscape, producing a place that is not obviously the location of an arts festival of international reputation. Ruth Fermoy made it one. She founded it in 1951, and she ran it, and she sustained it through the decades of building the program and raising the money and managing the politics of a cultural institution in a small town where the cultural institution's existence is not inevitable but requires someone to decide it is going to exist and to keep deciding it through the years when the deciding is difficult. She kept deciding. The festival brought musicians to King's Lynn who had no particular reason to come to King's Lynn, except that Ruth Fermoy had organized the occasion, and Ruth Fermoy's organizational intelligence and her specific connections in the musical world, the world she had been formed in at the Paris Conservatoire, and that had remained her professional home alongside the palace world, were sufficient to make the occasion worth coming for. It ran every year. It is running now. This is the part of Ruth Fermoy's legacy that the account of her choices regarding Diana and Frances consistently underweights, not because it changes the accounting of the choices, but because the full portrait of who she was requires it. She was not only the woman who chose the institution over her family, She was also the woman who built something real in the cultural life of Norfolk that has outlasted her by 30 years, and that will outlast her for as long as there are people in King's Lynn who understand why someone in 1951 decided that a port town on the Norfolk coast should have an international arts festival. The two things, the King's Lynn Festival and the choices regarding Diana, are the products of the same person. The same intelligence, the same organizational capacity, the same ability to identify what needed doing and to sustain the doing of it over time. The intelligence and the capacity served the festival, and they served the institution, and they were not available, in the ways that mattered most, to Francis or to Diana. This is the specific complexity of Ruth Fermoy that simple portraits do not hold. The intelligence that built the King's Lynn Festival was the same intelligence that saw clearly what the match between Diana and Charles would cost Diana and declined to act on the seeing. The organizational capacity that sustained an arts festival for 40 years was the same organizational capacity that managed the 1992 interview and the institutional counter-narrative with the efficiency of someone who understood what was needed and produced it. The same capacities, different deployments. The deployment was determined by the priority. The priority was the institution. The Queen Mother was the institution's most personal expression in Ruth's life, the specific human form through which the institutional priority became not an abstraction but a relationship, not a requirement but an affection, not a professional obligation but the primary connection of her later decades. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon was not a simple woman. She has been discussed in this account primarily as a figure in the background of other people's stories, but in the specific story of Ruth Fermoy, she was the central figure, the person whose orbit Ruth had entered in the late 1930s and never left, whose friendship with Ruth was genuine, in the way of friendships between people who have been in each other's worlds for long enough, that the presence of each has become part of the other's sense of what the world contains. The Queen Mother lived until 2002. She outlived Ruth by 9 years. She outlived Diana by 5. She attended Ruth's funeral in 1993, and she attended Diana's funeral in 1997, and she attended the funerals of the people who departed before her with the composed grief of someone who has organized herself around outlasting almost everyone, and who has managed the outlasting with the specific discipline of someone for whom public composure is the primary professional obligation, regardless of what the composure is covering. She did not speak publicly about Ruth in any specific sense that the record has captured. The not speaking was consistent with how the Queen Mother managed most things, through the specific mechanism of not contributing to the public record anything that would complicate the institutional narrative, through the maintenance of the private space where the actual feeling went, through the long practice of being exactly as much visible in the public record as she chose to be and no more. She chose to be visible as the warm and beloved figure of public affection that she had cultivated since before the war. She chose not to be visible in the specific records of what she knew about Diana and what she thought about it. She knew things. The Queen Mother was inside the institution in the deepest possible sense, not just as a participant in it, but as one of its defining figures, someone whose understanding of the institution and its requirements went back to 1936, and whose relationship to everything that happened within the institution, from 1936 onward, was the relationship of someone who had been there from the beginning of the modern monarchy, in its specific form. She knew about Charles and Camilla before the wedding. She knew about Diana's difficulties in the early years. She had access to the specific information that the inner circle of the royal household circulated among itself, and she was at the center of the inner circle. She also had Ruth. Ruth told the Queen Mother things. This is not documented in any specific form. The specific content of what Ruth communicated to the Queen Mother across 30 years of daily proximity is in the interior of a relationship that neither woman committed to the public record. But the structure of the relationship, the lady-in-waiting who was trusted with everything and who served the relationship with total devotion, is the structure of a relationship in which information flows from the lady-in-waiting to the principal. Ruth flowed information to the Queen Mother. What information about Diana she communicated, what she said about the difficulties of the early years, about the eating disorder, about the specific failures of the marriage, to provide what Diana needed, is in the interior of the relationship, which is where it remains. What is not in the interior is the outcome. The outcome was that the institutional response to Diana's situation throughout the early years of the marriage was the institutional response of an institution that had decided what it wanted and was managing the situation accordingly. The institutional response was not organized around Diana's welfare. Whether the Queen Mother's specific knowledge of Diana's situation, the knowledge Ruth may or may not have communicated to her, influenced the institutional response in any particular direction, is not something the record establishes with confidence. What the record establishes is that the institutional response was what it was. The institutional response was managed by people who were organized around the institutional priority. Ruth was organized around the institutional priority. The Queen Mother was organized around the institutional priority. The priority was the marriage as a functioning institutional product, as the constitutional arrangement that the institution had produced, and that it required to continue in the form it required. Diana was inside the arrangement. Her welfare was not the priority. This is the thing that the specific relationship between Ruth and the Queen Mother illustrates in the context of this account. Not that either of them was malicious toward Diana, not that either of them wished her harm, but that the institutional priority they were both organized around did not include Diana's welfare in the form that Diana's welfare required. The priority was the institution. Diana was a component of the institution. Components are managed, not advocated for. Ruth managed Diana, not the active management of a household official, not the direct management of the press office or the private secretary. The management of the person who holds the institutional knowledge about a component of the institution and who deploys that knowledge in the service of the institutional priority. In 1980, the deployment was the endorsement. In 1992, the deployment was the interview. In between, the deployment was the silence, the specific silence of someone who knows things that would complicate the institutional management of the situation and who keeps them in the interior, where the institutional management cannot be complicated by them. Ruth was an exceptionally skilled manager. She managed Diana's situation with the efficiency that characterized everything she managed. The King's Lynn Festival, the Queen Mother's official schedule, the specific social logistics of a 30-year career inside the royal household. She applied the same precision and the same sustained intelligence and the same commitment to the priority she had identified as the organizing principle. The priority was the institution. She managed Diana in service of the institution. The institution received the management. Diana paid the cost. The Queen Mother died in March 2002 at 101 years old, having outlived Ruth by 9 years and Diana by 5. She died in the specific season of the double loss that the year 2002 produced. Margaret had died 6 weeks earlier, and the year contained both deaths, and the coverage of both was the coverage of the end of a generation that had been the primary generation of the institution for 60 years. The Queen Mother's death generated an outpouring of public feeling that was genuine in the way that the public feeling for the Queen Mother had always been genuine, produced by someone who was exceptionally good at producing it, who had cultivated the warmth and the accessibility and the specific quality of being beloved across 8 decades with the same precision that Ruth had cultivated the lady-in-waiting role. She died as she had lived, beloved, public, inside the institution she had served, and that had served her for longer than most institutions, and most people are capable of sustaining such a mutual arrangement. Ruth was not there. She had been dead for 9 years. She had not been there for the final years of the woman whose orbit had organized the final decades of Ruth's life, had not been there for the Queen Mother's 100th birthday in 2000, or for the specific diminishment of the last years, or for the death itself in March. The absence is worth noting, not because it changes anything about the accounting of Ruth's choices, but because it is a reminder that the institutional formations that produce the specific loyalties this account has been describing do not always outlast the people around whom they are organized. Ruth was organized around the Queen Mother. The Queen Mother outlived Ruth. The organizing principle of Ruth's later life outlasted her. She gave everything to a relationship and an institution that continued without her. This is the common condition of the people who serve institutions most completely. They give everything to the continuity of the thing, and the thing continues after them, as it continued before them, as it will continue after the people who are currently serving it have given everything they have and been filed as concluded. The institution files people as concluded. It filed Maurice Fermoy as concluded in 1955. It filed Ruth Fermoy as concluded in 1993. It will file everyone as concluded in due course. The concluding is not cruelty. It is the specific impersonality of the institution, the thing that the institution is that makes it an institution, rather than a relationship, that makes it something that continues across the human lifetimes of the people who serve it, rather than something that requires their survival to survive. Ruth understood this impersonality. She served it anyway. She served it with the completeness of someone who has found in the service itself the form of meaning that the service provides, and who has organized her life around that meaning with sufficient thoroughness that the alternatives to the service recede until they are theoretical rather than actual. The alternatives were theoretical by the time the choices that mattered most were made. In 1980, when Diana's future was being arranged, the alternative to the institutional priority, the alternative of a grandmother who organized herself around the granddaughter rather than the palace, was theoretical. In practice, Ruth was Lady Fermoy. Lady Fermoy endorsed the match. Diana married the prince. The rest of the story is the rest of the story. The rest of the story ended in a tunnel in Paris in August 1997, and the ending was the ending that the specific sequence of choices and their consequences had been building toward since 1980, and arguably since 1967, and arguably since 1931, when Ruth married Maurice Fermoy and moved on to the Sandringham estate and began the decades of proximity to the royal family that would produce everything that followed. The festival is still running. The music continues. In King's Lynn, in the churches and the guild halls, in the summer weeks when the festival organizes itself around the program that Ruth built and that has continued building itself since her death, in those weeks, the most lasting evidence of who Ruth Fermoy was, outside the palace, and outside the family, and outside the accounting of the choices she made in service of the institution, is present and audible. It is worth hearing. It is worth hearing alongside everything else this account has said, not to diminish the accounting, not to provide the comfortable resolution that the accounting does not warrant, but to hold the full portrait of someone who was more than her worst choices, and whose worst choices had consequences that the full portrait does not erase. The festival, the choices, both are there, both are hers. There is a grave in Norfolk. It is in the churchyard at Flitcham, a small village a few miles from Sandringham, in the flat East Anglian landscape that Ruth Fermoy had inhabited since she married Maurice in 1931, and that she never fully left, even in the years when the palace world occupied the center of her life. The grave is not elaborate. It marks the burial of a woman who was 84 years old when she died, who had been born in Aberdeenshire and had trained in Paris, and had married a baron, and had founded an arts festival, and had been a lady-in-waiting to a queen, and who had known, more intimately than almost anyone outside the royal family itself, the specific interior world of the institution she served. She is buried in the landscape she chose. The landscape continues. The institution continues. The festival continues. The accounting of what she chose and what the choosing cost is what this account has been constructing across 12 parts. And part 12 is not the place for the recapitulation of what has already been said, but for the question the accounting produces, the question of what Ruth Fermoy's specific story reveals that the other stories in this particular series of accounts also reveal, from their different angles and their different specifics, about the institution that organized the choices of all of them. The institution organized the choices of Crawford, who gave 16 years and received silence. The institution organized the choices of Townsend, who was exiled to Brussels and who loved Margaret in the present tense for 43 years. The institution organized the choices of Margaret, who wrote the statement in October 1955 and paid for the writing of it for the rest of her life. The institution organized the choices of Tiggy, who gave 4 years of herself to 2 boys who needed her and received no formal acknowledgement that the giving had happened. The institution organized the choices of Princess Michael, who arrived with her own formation and found the institution unable to contain it for 44 years and counting. and the institution organized the choices of Ruth Fermoy, who gave it 32 years of Lady Fermoy, and gave it her daughter in 1967, and gave it her granddaughter in 1980, and held in the interior the knowing that the giving was wrong, and managed the interior with the discipline of someone for whom the institutional priority was the organizing principle that all other things were arranged around. Each story is different in its specifics. Each story is continuous in its structure. The structure is this: the institution needs something from the person in its orbit. The person provides what the institution needs. The institution receives what is provided and continues. The person pays whatever cost the providing extracts. The institution does not account for the cost. The cost accumulates in the life of the person who paid it. The institution moves forward. The moving forward is what institutions do. The moving forward does not require them to examine what the moving was built on. Ruth's specific contribution to the moving forward was the management of the arrangement between Diana and Charles, the specific operation of providing the institutional endorsement that confirmed what the institution had decided, drawn from the personal knowledge that made the endorsement authoritative, in exchange for the institutional position that the endorsement maintained. The exchange was not explicit. Nobody sat Ruth down and said, "We need your endorsement, and we will maintain your position if you give it." The exchange operated through the specific mechanism of the institutional formation, through the priority structure that the formation had installed, that made the institutional response the natural response, that made the maintenance of the position feel not like a calculation, but like what was right. It felt right to Ruth to endorse the match. It felt right because feeling right was what the institutional formation had produced, the specific alignment between the formation's priority and the individual's sense of what the situation required, so that the institutional response and the person's own judgment were, in the relevant moments, indistinguishable. This is the deepest thing about institutional formation, and it is the hardest thing to hold clearly, because it requires understanding that the people who make the choices that damage other people in service of the institution are frequently not people who understand themselves to be making that choice. Ruth did not experience herself as choosing the palace over Diana. She experienced herself as doing what was right. What was right and what the palace required were, in her interior experience of the situation, the same thing. This is what 32 years of Lady Fermoy had produced. The production is the institution's product. Not Diana's suffering. The institution did not intend Diana's suffering, did not organize itself around producing it, would not have endorsed it as a purpose if the purpose had been named. What the institution intended was the marriage, the institutional outcome, the constitutional arrangement. What it produced, alongside the arrangement, was Diana's suffering. And alongside Diana's suffering, the specific condition of Ruth Fermoy, the woman whose formation had made the suffering possible by removing the internal resistance that would otherwise have produced advocacy. The formation removed the resistance. Diana suffered. The institution moved forward. The institution is still moving forward. What it has not done, and what it will not do, is examine the specific mechanism by which the formation it produces in the people it absorbs most completely makes those people capable of the specific failures this account has described. Crawford did not fail Diana. Crawford was failed by the same institution that failed Diana, was the subject of the institutional indifference to the cost it extracted from the people it used, the governess version of the same structural problem. But Ruth failed Diana. She failed her through the specific operation of the institutional formation that had replaced her capacity to prioritize the person over the position. The failure was real and was consequential and was produced by the institution without the institution acknowledging its production. The acknowledgement is not coming. The institution does not acknowledge the mechanisms by which it organizes people around its own priorities at the expense of the people around them. It does not examine the specific way that the Lady Fermoy formation produces Lady Fermoy's ability to endorse the match. It does not ask whether the formation itself is something that should be examined. It continues. Diana is dead. She has been dead for 27 years. The coverage of her death and the coverage of her life and the coverage of the marriage and the coverage of what the marriage was and what it cost her have been running continuously since the 31st of August 1997. In the specific form of the cultural conversation that attaches to people whose public presence was large enough and whose story was resonant enough that the story does not conclude with the death, but continues in the form of the ongoing engagement with what the person was and what happened to them and what it means. The ongoing engagement with Diana has produced many things. It has not produced a serious institutional examination of what Ruth Fermoy did, and why, and what produced the doing. The serious institutional examination would require the institution to examine its own formation mechanisms, to ask what the 32 years of Lady Fermoy did to Ruth's capacity to advocate for Diana, and whether the formation that produced that incapacity is a formation the institution should examine, and whether the examination should produce changes in how the institution forms the people it absorbs most completely. The institution has not performed this examination. It has performed other examinations. It has examined its communication practices, its relationship with the press, the specific mechanisms of the public image management that the Diana years exposed as insufficient. It has updated its press operation and its communication strategy and its general approach to the management of the public narrative. It has not examined Ruth Fermoy, not because Ruth Fermoy is not worth examining, because examining Ruth Fermoy would require examining the thing that produced Ruth Fermoy, which is the institutional formation itself, the decades of Lady Fermoy, the specific priority structure the formation installed, the mechanisms by which the formation replaced Diana's welfare with the institutional priority in the ordering of Ruth's responses to the situation she was in. The examination of that mechanism is the examination of the institution examining itself. The institution does not examine itself in that way. What remains, in the absence of the institutional examination, is the record. The record is what this account has been assembling, not the complete record, which is larger than any account can contain, but the honest record. The record that tries to say clearly what happened and what the why reveals about the institution and the people it formed. The honest record says that Ruth Fermoy was a woman of genuine intelligence and genuine warmth and genuine organizational capacity, who built something real in the King's Lynn Festival and gave something real to the Queen Mother in 32 years of genuine devotion, and who failed her granddaughter. In the specific ways this account has described, because the formation she had undergone had made the institutional priority the organizing principle of the self, and the self organized around the institutional priority could not, in the moments that mattered most, locate a priority above it. The honest record says that Diana was a person who needed an advocate, and who had, in her grandmother, the person most specifically positioned to advocate for her, positioned by relationship, by knowledge, by institutional authority, and who did not receive the advocacy because the person most specifically positioned to provide it was organized around something else. The honest record says the institution received what it needed and continued. The honest record does not say Ruth was monstrous. Monstrousness is easier than what Ruth was, which was someone who loved her granddaughter and served the institution and found the two loyalties in conflict and resolved the conflict the way 32 years of Lady Fermoy had prepared her to resolve it, which was in the institution's favor, consistently and across the years during which the consistency mattered most. The honest record does not say the institution was malicious. Malice is easier than what the institution was, which was a structure organized around its own perpetuation that processed the people in its orbit, according to the priority of the perpetuation, without examining what the processing cost. The honest record says, both things are true. Ruth loved Diana and chose the institution. The institution needed the arrangement and received it. Diana paid what the receiving cost. All three things happened. None of them has been accounted for by the institution. None of them will be. The institution moves forward. Ruth is buried in Flitcham. Diana is buried at Althorpe, on an island in the lake on the Spencer estate, surrounded by water that makes the grave private in the specific way that Diana's life was rarely private. Protected from access, enclosed, hers in the way that very little was hers while she was alive. The island, the water, the grave. Frances is still alive. She is in her late 80s in Scotland, carrying what she carries, which is everything this account has described, and the decades beyond it. The mother who chose the institution twice against her family, the daughter who died in a tunnel at 36, the grandchildren who grew up inside the consequences of what the institution arranged for their mother. She carries it. She has carried it for decades. The carrying continues. The institution continues. The festival continues. The music in King's Lynn is real. The accounting of what was given and what was taken is real. Both are part of the portrait. The portrait is complete. This is what Ruth Fermoy left: the festival, the choices, the granddaughter she endorsed into the position that cost her everything, the daughter she chose against in the custody dispute that defined the family's shape for decades, the 32 years of Lady Fermoy that produced the formation that made the choices feel like what was right. It all belongs to the same portrait. The portrait belongs to the same institution. The institution has the portrait in its possession and has not examined it. The examining is here. The examining is all that is available when the institution declines to perform it. It has been performed in 12 parts. The performance is complete. William was born in June 1982 and Harry in September 1984, which means that everything this account has described, the endorsement, the silence, the marriage's private deterioration, the eating disorder, the loneliness, the specific conditions the institutional management of the arrangement had produced, was the world their mother was living inside, while she was also, simultaneously, the mother who was there when they woke up, and there when they went to sleep, and who held them, and read to them, and was, in the daily and specific and irreducible sense of the word, present. She was present for them, in conditions that made presence difficult. What the children received was not the uncomplicated warmth of a mother in circumstances that supported warmth. What they received was the warmth of a mother who was managing, simultaneously and continuously, the private reality of the marriage and the public performance of the princess, and the specific emotional cost of both, and who gave them what was available to give within those conditions, with the fullness that Diana brought to the things that genuinely mattered to her. They were the things that genuinely mattered to her. She gave them everything available. Everything available was shaped by what the conditions contained. Ruth had contributed to the conditions. The contribution was not visible to William and Harry as children. It is not clear that it has ever been made fully visible to them as adults. The specific role their great-grandmother by marriage played in the arrangement of the marriage that produced the conditions of their childhood is not a subject either of them has addressed publicly with the specificity that would establish what they know and what they think about what they know. What is visible in the public record of who William and Harry became as adults, in the choices they made, the positions they took, the specific ways they engaged with the institution they had been born into, and the institution's relationship to the people within it, suggests that both of them arrived, through different paths and with different emphases, at a clear-eyed understanding of what the institution had done to their mother. William's understanding expressed itself through the institutional channel, through the work he has done on mental health, through the sustained effort to make the institution more capable of acknowledging and addressing the specific kinds of suffering that Diana's situation had represented, through the gradual construction of a royal presence organized around genuine engagement with the real conditions of people's lives, rather than the formal management of public appearances. Harry's understanding expressed itself through the departure, through the specific decision that the institution was not capable of providing what the life he was trying to build required, and that the only available response was to leave. Both responses were shaped by what they had witnessed. What they had witnessed was their mother, inside the institution, that Ruth Fermoy had served with total devotion, inside the conditions the institution had produced for her, inside the marriage the institutional management had organized, inside the specific failure of the people who had the position and the knowledge to advocate for her to deploy, either in her service. Ruth was one of those people. They grew up in the shadow of what Ruth had not done, not knowing it was Ruth's shadow, knowing only the shape of it, the specific weight of having a mother who was loved by the public and managed by the institution, who was extraordinary in her public gifts and unsupported in her private difficulties, who was the most watched woman in the world and the least protected. The least protected because the protection was not organized around her. The protection was organized around the institution. Ruth was organized around the institution. The institution produced the conditions produced the childhood produced William and Harry. This is the final specific form of the cost that Ruth's choices extracted, not only from Diana, who was the immediate and most visible bearer of the cost, but from the generation that came after Diana, and that was formed inside the conditions Diana was formed inside. William and Harry were formed inside the conditions Ruth helped produce. They were shaped by the mother, who was shaped by those conditions. They carry, in whatever form the carrying takes in each of them, the specific weight of a childhood that was what it was, because of a sequence of choices that went back to 1980 and to 1967 and to 1931, when Ruth married Maurice and entered the orbit of the royal family with the specific formation she brought, and the specific ambition she carried, and the specific priority that the formation and the ambition would together produce across the decades. Ruth never met her great-grandchildren. She died in 1993. William was 11, Harry was 8. They may have encountered her in the general way of children who encounter the peripheral adults in their family's world, at the family occasions and the Sandringham gatherings where Lady Fermoy would have been present by virtue of being Lady Fermoy. The encounters, if they happened, are not in the record in any specific form. What is in the record is what they became. What they became was shaped by Diana. Diana was shaped by the conditions Ruth helped create. The shaping runs through the generations in the specific way that institutional choices made about individuals run through the lives that follow from those individuals, not as a conscious inheritance, not as something that is transmitted through deliberate communication, but as the structural condition of the world that the choices produced. Ruth's choices produced a world. William and Harry grew up in it. They are still living in the consequences of it, each of them differently, in the different institutional positions their birth order and their different responses to what they witnessed have placed them in, but both of them carrying what was formed in them in the conditions the world produced. There is a specific irony in this that the account of Ruth Fermoy has been building toward without quite naming, and part 13 is the place for the naming. The irony is this: Ruth Fermoy was, in the specific chain of connection, the person who linked the Spencer family to the royal family in the first place. Without Ruth's marriage to Maurice Fermoy, there was no Park House on the Sandringham estate. Without Park House, there was no childhood proximity between the Spencer children and the royal family. Without that proximity, there was no path by which Diana Spencer became the obvious candidate for the position the institution was organizing to fill. Without Diana Spencer becoming the obvious candidate, there was no wedding on the 29th of July 1981. Ruth was the origin of the connection. She was also the person who could have complicated the connection most decisively at the moment when complicating it would have mattered most. She originated it. She confirmed it. Both acts were Ruth's. The origination happened through the circumstances of her marriage and her life, through choices that were not made with Diana in mind, that preceded Diana's existence, that were the product of Ruth's own ambitions and her own formation and her own navigation of the specific world she had been born into and was moving through. The confirmation was different. The confirmation in 1980, the endorsement, the institutional assessment provided to the people who were organizing the arrangement, was made with Diana specifically in mind. It was made by someone who knew Diana, who had the personal knowledge to complicate the endorsement, and who provided the endorsement regardless. She built the bridge. She also refused to close it when closing it would have served Diana. The bridge, once built, carried Diana toward the position. The position produced the conditions. The conditions produced the children. The children became the people they became inside the conditions. This is the long chain of consequence that Ruth Fermoy's choices initiated and confirmed across the decades between 1931 and 1980 and beyond. The chain is real. The institution does not trace it. Tracing it would require the institution to examine the specific way that its formation of the people it absorbs most completely produces the specific incapacities this account has described. The incapacity to prioritize the person over the position, the incapacity to hold the private knowledge of the human situation above the institutional management of the same situation, the incapacity to say the true thing when the true thing would cost the institutional position that the formation has made indistinguishable from the self. The institution does not perform this examination. It continues. It continues with William, who is the heir, who carries what he carries inside the institution. His great-great-grandmother, by marriage, built the connection to, and whose life is still organized around the relationship to that institution. It continues with Harry, who left, who carries what he carries outside the institution, and who has made the carrying visible in ways the institution finds uncomfortable, and that are, for that reason, the most honest available evidence of what the institution's management of his childhood produced. It continues with the next generation, the children of William and Catherine, who are growing up inside the institution with parents who understand, from the inside and from direct experience, what the institution did to their mother, and who are therefore trying to produce for their children a different version of the institutional childhood than the one they experienced. The trying is real. Whether the trying produces what it is trying to produce is the question that the institution's structural relationship to the formation of the people inside it makes genuinely uncertain, because the formation operates through mechanisms that are not always visible to the people undergoing them. And the mechanisms that produced Ruth Fermoy are still the mechanisms the institution operates with, and the intentions of individual parents inside an institution, with those mechanisms, are not always sufficient to override what the mechanisms produce. What would override the mechanisms is the examination. The examination of the specific ways the formation works, and what it does, and what it produces when it produces a Ruth Fermoy, someone who loves her granddaughter and chooses the institution and cannot locate a priority above the choosing. The examination is what this account has been. The account is 12 parts and one additional part, and it is not the institution's account. The institution has not produced this account and will not produce it, and the absence of the institutional production is itself the most honest evidence of what this account has been arguing. That the institution does not examine what it produces, does not account for the cost of what it extracts, does not ask whether the formation that makes it function is the formation it should be producing in the people it asks to inhabit it. Ruth inhabited it for 32 years. She gave it everything it asked for. It asked for the endorsement. She gave it. Diana paid. William and Harry were formed inside the payment. The institution moved forward. Ruth is buried in Flitcham. The music plays in King's Lynn. The chain of consequence runs forward into the lives of the people who are still living inside what the choices produced. The accounting ends here. The consequences do not end. They continue in the specific form of 3 generations of people formed inside the world that the choices between 1931 and 1993 shaped. Not wholly, not only by these choices, but shaped by them in ways that the lives of the people involved make permanently visible. The lives are visible. The choices are visible. The institution that produced the choices, and that received what the choices gave it, while paying nothing for what the choices cost, is also visible. It is all visible now. This is what the accounting produces. Not resolution. Not the clean conclusion of a story that has reached its appropriate end. The visibility of the thing, the clear and honest naming of what happened, and what it cost, and who paid, and who did not, and what the institution that organized it all has never been required to examine about itself. Ruth is named. The choice is named. The cost is named. The institution that produced both is named. The naming is all that this kind of accounting can do. It has done it.
Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.